The Pacific Ocean does not give back what it takes. You already know this. The Titanic sits 2.5 miles beneath the North Atlantic, her bones visited by submersibles and documentary crews, her dead counted and catalogued and mourned. The Edmund Fitzgerald lies in Lake Superior, her bell recovered, her crew memorialised in song. The Lusitania, the Andrea Doria, the Empress of Ireland, we know where they rest. We have sent cameras into their darkness. We have named their dead. But I want to tell you about a ship that did none of these things. A ship that refused to sink, that drifted for 5 weeks across 600 miles of open ocean, with her engine still warm, her pumps still working, her lights still burning, and not a single soul left aboard to explain what had happened. 25 people, men, women, and children. A captain with a past he was running from, a first mate no one remembers hiring, a doctor whose medical bag was found open, whose bloodied bandages were scattered across the deck, whose patients, if he had any, vanished without leaving behind so much as a shoe. No bodies, no wreckage, no farewell notes scratched into the paint. Just an empty ship listing badly to port, her radio set to the international distress frequency, but transmitting on a wavelength so dead that no station on Earth could have heard her cry for help. The Joyita. The name means little jewel in Spanish. She was built in 1931, the same year the Empire State Building opened its doors and Al Capone went to prison for tax evasion. She was designed for pleasure, for weekend trips along the California coast, for champagne on the aft deck and laughter under the stars. For 24 years she carried the wealthy and the carefree through calm waters, and then she sailed into the South Pacific and she became something else entirely. She became a question that 4 official inquiries could not answer. She became a wound that has never healed. If you have heard of the Joyita at all, you probably heard her called the Mary Celeste of the Pacific, and the comparison is inevitable. Both ships were found drifting without their crews, both presented mysteries that spawned decades of speculation, both have become shorthand for the inexplicable. But I think the comparison does the Joyita a disservice. The Mary Celeste was found in 1872, an age when record-keeping was imperfect, when wireless telegraphy did not exist, when a ship could vanish into the Atlantic and leave behind only the faintest trace. The Joyita disappeared in 1955. There were radios, there were coastguards, there were scheduled shipping lanes and harbour masters and manifest logs. The entire apparatus of 20th century maritime bureaucracy was in place, humming along, theoretically designed to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophe. And it failed completely. 25 people stepped aboard that vessel in Apia, Western Samoa on the morning of October 3rd, 1955. They waved to their families. They carried their luggage up the gangway. They settled into their berths and prepared for what should have been a routine voyage. A 2-day trip through familiar waters to the Tokelau Islands. A journey of roughly 270 miles through some of the calmest seas on Earth. None of them were ever seen again. The search that followed was massive. Royal New Zealand Air Force planes crisscrossed the Pacific, ships diverted from their routes to scan the horizon. Radio operators across a dozen islands listened for any transmission, any signal, any word. They found nothing. For 37 days the ocean offered up no evidence that the Joyita had ever existed. And then, on November 10th, a merchant vessel named the Tuvalu spotted something impossible. A ship listing 45 degrees to port, her starboard rail barely above the waterline, drifting silently in open ocean, 600 miles from where she should have been, in completely the wrong direction, moving with no human hand on her wheel. The captain of the Tuvalu, a man named Gerald Douglas, brought his vessel alongside and sent a boarding party across. What they found aboard the Joyita would haunt them for the rest of their lives. What they did not find would haunt the rest of us. I have spent more time with the Joyita than is probably healthy. I have read the official inquiry transcripts, all 4 of them, and I can tell you that they contradict each other in ways that suggest no one, not the investigators, not the witnesses, not the authorities, ever agreed on what happened that October night. I have read the captain's correspondence, the letters he sent to creditors begging for more time, the private notes that reveal a man drowning in debt even as his ship was taking on water. I have read the testimony of the survivor who came forward in the 1960s, who claimed he could finally tell the truth, whose story fell apart under scrutiny but never quite fell apart enough to be dismissed entirely. And I still do not know what happened, but I think you should hear what we do know. I think you should meet the people who boarded that ship, who trusted their lives to her hull, and her captain and the calm Pacific morning. I think you should understand why the Joyita, of all the ships that have disappeared without trace, has never stopped whispering her question across the decades. So let me take you back. Let me take you to Samoa in 1955, to a small island nation still finding its footing in the post-war world, to a harbour where a strange and beautiful ship was preparing for her final voyage. The town of Apia sits on the northern coast of Upolu, the second largest island in Western Samoa. In 1955, it was the capital of a territory still administered by New Zealand, a place where the Union Jack flew alongside the Samoan flag and where British bureaucracy mingled uneasily with Polynesian tradition. The harbour was small but busy, the economic heart of the islands, the only place where cargo ships from the wider world could dock and discharge their goods. Picture it in early October. The rainy season has not yet arrived. The mornings are warm and the evenings are soft and the air smells of copra, dried coconut flesh, the cash crop that keeps the islands alive. Fishing boats bob at their moorings alongside trading vessels from Australia and New Zealand. The wharf is alive with longshoremen loading and unloading, with customs officials checking manifests, with children running between the crates, daring each other to jump into the warm water. And tied up at one of the better berths, conspicuous among the working vessels, there is a ship that does not quite belong. The Joyita is 70 feet long and displaces 47 tons. She has a wooden hull painted white, though the paint is peeling now, showing the grey beneath. Her superstructure is teak, weathered by years of Pacific sun, and her engines are twin grey marine diesels that burn through fuel faster than her economics can really support. She's a yacht, or she was. You can see it in her lines, in the way she sits in the water, in the elegant sweep of her bow. She was built for men who did not count their money, and now she is owned by a man who cannot stop counting his. Thomas Henry Miller, duly to his friends, stands on her deck and watches the cargo being loaded. He's 53 years old, American by birth, British by inclination, Pacific Islander by fate. His hair has gone grey and his face has gone weathered, but he still carries himself with the posture of the Royal Navy officer he once was. He wears his white captain's cap at a careful angle. His shirt is freshly pressed despite the heat. His shoes are polished. He needs this voyage. He needs it badly. For the last 2 years, Miller has been chartering the Joyita for whatever work he can find. He carries cargo between the islands. He takes government officials on inspection tours. He runs supplies to isolated atolls where no other vessel will go. The work is sporadic and the pay is thin, and his creditors, there are several, have begun sending letters with words like foreclosure and seizure printed in bold type. The ship is his only asset. He owes more on her than she is worth. If this voyage does not pay, if the charter fee does not come through, he will lose her, and with her the last remnant of the life he built when he came to these islands 20 years ago. So he watches the cargo with particular care. 44 empty fuel drums, destined for the Tokelau Islands, medical supplies for the hospital there, timber, food, general cargo. The Joyita is riding low in the water, lower than he would like, but not dangerously so. She has made this trip before. She can make it again. Miller does not know, cannot know, that 3 months ago a pipe connected to the engine cooling system cracked somewhere deep in the Joyita's bilge. The crack is small, almost invisible, and the leak it produces is slow, but it has been weeping seawater into the hull every hour of every day, a few gallons at a time, and the wooden boards around it have begun to soften and separate. He does not know that the ship's main radio transmitter has been damaged for weeks, ever since a careless dock worker dropped a crate on the antenna housing. The transmitter still works, after a fashion, but only on frequencies that Samoan coastal stations no longer monitor. When Miller tests the radio, it crackles to life. When he speaks into the microphone, his voice goes nowhere at all. He does not know any of this. He knows only that the cargo is loaded and the passengers are arriving, that the morning tide will turn in 2 hours and that he must be underway. The passengers gathered on the Apia wharf that morning were a peculiar cross-section of Pacific Island society. They were not tourists. Tourism in 1955 Samoa was barely a concept, nor were they emigrants leaving for distant shores. They were locals mostly, people with business in the Tokelau or family to visit or government duties to perform. The most prominent among them was a British colonial official named Purlis, a district agent responsible for administration of the Tokelau Islands. He had travelled this route many times, always on the Joyita, always with Captain Miller at the helm. He trusted the ship. He trusted the man. When his wife asked if the voyage was safe, he laughed and told her he'd been through worse in the war. There was a doctor named Parsons, a New Zealand physician, who served the isolated communities of the outer islands. He carried with him a medical bag filled with the supplies that would keep the clinic running for another month. Bandages, antiseptic, morphine, surgical tools. He was travelling with his assistant, a young Samoan woman whose name has been lost to history, but whose calm competence had saved more than one life in the makeshift operating theatres of the atolls. There were Samoan families, mothers with children, men travelling for work, elders going to visit relatives they had not seen in years. Their names appear in the manifest, recorded by the harbour master in careful copperplate script: Tanelu, Philemoni, Fa'afuina. Names that meant something to the people who loved them, names that would appear in newspapers around the world when the search began, names that eventually faded from public memory as the years passed and no answers came. There were 3 children aboard. The youngest was 4 years old, and there was the first mate, a man whose presence on the Joyita has never been adequately explained. His name was Chuck Simpson, at least that was the name he gave. He had arrived in Apia 3 weeks earlier on a freighter from Auckland, carrying a sea bag and a story about mechanical experience in the New Zealand Merchant Marine. Miller needed a first mate. Simpson needed work. The interview took place in a waterfront bar and lasted less than an hour. No references were checked. No credentials were verified. In the desperate economy of Pacific shipping, such informalities were common. Simpson was a large man, heavily muscled, with a tattoo on his left forearm that some witnesses remembered as a ship's anchor, and others remembered as a snake. He spoke little and drank much. He had a way of looking at people that made them uncomfortable, a flatness in his eyes that suggested he had seen things he did not wish to discuss. No one who met Chuck Simpson in Apia ever saw him again. No one who knew him before Apia ever came forward to identify him. When investigators later tried to trace his background, they found nothing. No naval records, no merchant marine certificates, no previous employers who remembered his name. He boarded the Joyita that morning and stood at the rail, watching the last of the cargo come aboard. He did not wave to anyone on the wharf. He did not speak to the other passengers. He simply waited, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. The morning tide began to turn at 7 o'clock. By 7:30, the Joyita's mooring lines had been cast off, her engines were rumbling, and she was backing slowly away from the wharf into the harbour. The passengers crowded the rail to wave goodbye. On the dock, families waved back, already planning for the reunion in 2 weeks when the ship would return. Captain Miller stood at the wheel, his eyes on the harbour entrance, his thoughts, we can only imagine, on the debts that pressed against him and the paycheck that waited in Tokelau. The Joyita cleared the reef and turned her bow north, toward open ocean, toward the islands that waited 270 miles away. The sky was clear, the sea was calm. The ship's chronometer read 7:45 in the morning on October 3rd, 1955. It was the last time the Joyita would be seen for 37 days. The Tokelau Islands are 3 coral atolls scattered across the Pacific about 300 miles north of Samoa. In 1955, they were home to perhaps 1,500 people, Polynesian communities that had lived in the same place for 1,000 years, that survived on fish and coconut and the occasional cargo ship that brought supplies from the wider world. There was no airport. There was no harbour deep enough for large vessels. The only way to reach the Tokelau was by small boat, threading through the reef passages that the locals knew by heart and that outsiders learned only through disaster. The Joyita had made the voyage before. Captain Miller knew the route, knew the currents, knew the timing. In good weather, the trip should take 48 hours. The ship would arrive at Whakaufo, the administrative centre, discharge her cargo, load whatever copra and handicrafts the islanders had to trade, and return to Apia within 2 weeks. It was routine, it was safe. The Pacific between Samoa and Tokelau was one of the calmest stretches of ocean on Earth, a blue expanse where storms were rare and the swells were gentle. The Joyita was expected in Whakaufo on the morning of October 5th. She did not arrive. At first, no one was concerned. Delays were common in Pacific shipping. Engines broke down, currents shifted, captains sometimes stopped at outer islands to trade for fresh fruit or to give their crews a few hours ashore. The Tokelau radio operator sent a message to Apia. Joyita not arrived. Advise. The response came back within the day. Ship departed on schedule. Expect arrival shortly. By October 6th, concern had sharpened into alarm. The radio operator in Fecalfo sent another message, more urgent this time. Appia responded that they had no contact with the vessel, that she had not been heard from since clearing the harbour. A third message came from Fecalfo that evening. No sign of Joyita. Request search. But the search did not begin immediately. The machinery of colonial bureaucracy moved slowly, and there were procedures to follow, permissions to obtain, resources to allocate. It was not until October 8th, 5 days after the Joyita had left Apia, that the first search aircraft took to the skies. A Royal New Zealand Air Force Sunderland flying boat lifted off from Fiji and began sweeping the ocean between Samoa and Tokelau. Her crew scanned the waves for any sign of wreckage, any glint of white hull against blue water, any distress signal flashing from a life raft. They found nothing. Over the next 3 weeks, the search expanded. More aircraft joined, ships diverted from their routes to assist. Radio operators across the Pacific listened on every frequency for any transmission from the missing vessel. The ocean offered up nothing but silence. On the wharf in Apia, the families of the passengers gathered every morning and every evening, watching the harbour mouth for a ship that never came. Children asked where their fathers had gone. Wives waited for husbands. Mothers prayed for sons. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into a kind of suspended grief. Not mourning, not yet, because there was nothing to mourn, no bodies to bury, no certainty to cling to. Just absence. Just the empty place at the table. Just the question that no one could answer. Where was the Joyita? On November 10th, 1955, a merchant vessel named the Tuvalu was steaming through open ocean approximately 90 miles north of Fiji when her lookout spotted something strange on the horizon. At first, the captain thought it was a reef, a dangerous anomaly, since no reef was charted in that position. He altered course to investigate, concerned that he might need to report an uncharted hazard. As the Tuvalu drew closer, the shape resolved itself, and Captain Gerald Douglas felt a chill run down his spine despite the tropical heat. It was a ship, a white ship listing so badly to port that her starboard rail was nearly vertical, her deck at a 45-degree angle to the water, her masts pointing at the sky like the arms of a drowning man. She was drifting silently. No smoke from her funnel, no figures on her deck, no response to the Tuvalu's whistle. Douglas brought his vessel alongside and hailed the derelict. No answer came. He sent a boat across with 3 of his best men, armed with ropes and caution, and the unspoken fear that they were about to discover something terrible. What they found was worse than terrible. It was incomprehensible. The Joyita was still afloat, barely. Her port side was awash, and seawater sloshed through her lower compartments with every swell. But her engine room was dry. Her pumps were still functioning. Her fuel tanks still held oil. With minimal effort, the boarding party was able to start her auxiliary pump and begin reducing the list. The ship, they realised, could have been saved at any point in the previous 5 weeks. All it would have taken was someone to operate the machinery. But there was no one. The decks were deserted. The cabins were empty. The bridge stood silent. The wheel unmanned. The throttle at dead slow. In the captain's cabin, Miller's personal effects lay undisturbed. His uniforms hanging in the closet, his shaving kit on the washstand, his photograph of a woman no one could identify propped on the small desk. The cargo hold was half empty. The 44 fuel drums were gone. The timber was gone. The medical supplies were gone. Much of the food was gone. But not all of it. Some provisions remained, as if the evacuation, if there had been an evacuation, had been interrupted. And then the boarding party found the things that turned a mystery into a nightmare. On the deck, scattered as if dropped in haste, they found a doctor's bag. It was open, its contents spilled across the boards. Scalpels, bandages, bottles of antiseptic, a case of morphine ampules with 3 missing. Near the bag they found bandages soaked in blood. Not the rust brown of old blood, but the darker, damper stain of blood that had dried more recently. The bandages were not wadded and discarded. They were lying flat, as if they had been applied to a wound and then removed, as if someone had been treating an injured patient and had simply vanished mid-procedure. In the wheelhouse they found the radio. It was tuned to the international distress frequency. 2,182 kilocycles, the wavelength that every ship, every coastal station, every rescue service on Earth was supposed to monitor around the clock. But something was wrong. The radio was transmitting on a different wavelength entirely, a frequency that had been deprecated years earlier, a dead channel that no one listened to anymore. The operator, Miller presumably, had followed the correct procedure, had set the correct frequency, but the equipment had betrayed him. His distress calls, if he made them, had gone out into the Pacific and been heard by no one. On the aft deck, near the spot where the ship's 2 lifeboats should have been secured, the boarding party found only empty davits. The boats were gone. The emergency raft was gone. Every piece of flotation equipment aboard the Joyita had been launched and had vanished into the Pacific without a trace. One more detail. It would not be discovered until the Joyita was towed into port and subjected to a more thorough examination. But I will tell you now because it matters. The ship's logbook, the daily record of her position, her heading, her engine performance, every detail that might have explained what happened, was missing. Not destroyed, not washed away, simply gone, as if someone had removed it deliberately. Captain Douglas and his men stood on the listing deck of the Joyita and looked at each other in the failing light. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the water gold and crimson, and they were alone on a ghost ship with blood on the deck and no bodies to explain it. Douglas made the decision to take the Joyita in tow. It was the right choice, the humane choice, the seaman-like choice. The ship could still be saved, and saving her might save whatever secrets she carried. The Tuvalu secured her lines and began the slow journey toward Fiji, dragging the derelict behind her, leaving behind only the empty ocean and the question that hung in the air like the smell of blood. Where were they? All 25 of them. Of the captain with his debts, the doctor with his bag, the first mate with his flat eyes, the colonial official, the families, the children. Where had they gone? The Pacific kept its silence. The waves closed over whatever had happened, and the Joyita, her hull groaning, her deck still stained, drifted eastward at the end of a tow rope, carrying her mystery toward a port that would never solve it. The news reached Apia before the ship did. A radio message from the Tuvalu, relayed through Suva, confirmed what no one wanted to hear. The Joyita had been found 600 miles from her intended course, abandoned, flooded, with evidence of bloodshed and no sign of survivors. On the wharf where the passengers had boarded 6 weeks earlier, the families gathered again. But this time they did not watch the harbour mouth with hope. This time they watched it with a grief that was still half disbelief. The terrible grief of not knowing, of being denied even the certainty of death. The children who had asked where their fathers had gone now asked different questions. Questions that had no answers. Questions that would echo through their lives for decades. Some of them are still asking. The Joyita was towed into Suva Harbour on November the 12th, 1955. She was beached for inspection, her hull propped upright with timber, her decks washed clean by sailors who tried not to look at the bloodstains. The investigation began immediately, and it would consume the next 2 years of official time without producing anything resembling a conclusion. But before we turn to the 4 inquiries, before we examine the theories and the contradictions and the maddening gaps in the evidence, I want you to hold this moment in your mind. I want you to stand on the wharf at Suva and look at the ship. She's still beautiful, even now. You can see the lines she was born with, the sweep of her bow, the grace of her stern. She was built for joy. It's right there in her name, Joyita, Little Jewel. And she ended up here, beached and broken, a 70-foot question mark that refuses to yield to investigation. 25 people trusted her. 25 people boarded her on a clear October morning and expected to reach their destination in 2 days. Somewhere between Samoa and Tokelau, between the known and the unknown, something happened that erased them from the world. The ocean took them, or someone took them, or they took themselves. We do not know which. After 4 investigations, 3 newspaper exposés, 1 purported survivor who was probably lying, and 70 years of speculation, we still do not know which. What we know is what the Tuvalu found. An empty ship, a broken radio, blood on the deck, and silence. And maybe that is the point. Maybe the Joyita persists in memory precisely because she refuses to be solved, because the human mind cannot accept a mystery without an ending. We are storytelling creatures. We need our tragedies to have explanations, our disasters to have causes, our dead to have graves. The Joyita denies us all of that. She gives us only questions and the unbearable weight of not knowing. I want to answer those questions if I can. I want to walk you through what we actually know, the testimony, the evidence, the competing theories, and see if we can find something that looks like truth beneath the layers of confusion and cover-up. But I must warn you, I've spent more hours with this case than I care to admit, and I am not confident that I can give you the ending you want. The Joyita may be the rare disaster that genuinely has no answer, the ship that sailed into the Pacific and took her secrets with her. Or maybe there is an answer, and we've simply been looking in the wrong place. Let me take you to the investigation. The first inquiry convened in Suva, Fiji, on December 15, 1955, barely a month after the Joyita was towed into harbour. It was conducted by the Commissioner of the Western Pacific, a British colonial official named J.P. Williams, and it had the air of a proceeding that was expected to produce answers quickly and move on. Williams was a practical man, an administrator rather than an investigator, and his approach to the Joyita mystery was shaped by that practicality. He wanted facts, he wanted timelines, he wanted someone to explain, in simple terms, what had gone wrong and who was responsible. He got none of these things. The first witnesses called were the crew of the Tuvalu, Captain Douglas and the 3 men who had boarded the derelict. They described what they had found in careful nautical detail: the angle of the list, the condition of the hull, the state of the engines, the position of the cargo, the bloodstains, the missing lifeboats. Their testimony took 3 days, and at the end of it, Williams was no closer to understanding what had happened than he had been at the beginning. The investigators examined the Joyita herself, now sitting in dry dock, her hull exposed for the first time since she had been launched. What they found was troubling. The crack in the cooling pipe was discovered immediately. It ran along a seam where 2 wooden planks met, invisible from above, catastrophic from below. Seawater had been pouring into the Joyita's bilge for months, not in a torrent that would have been noticed immediately, but in a slow, steady trickle that would have accumulated over time, filling the lowest compartments, creeping upward as the voyage progressed. But here was the strange thing. The Joyita was designed not to sink. Her builder, a man named Roland West, had packed her hull with cork insulation, several tons of it, filling every dead space between her ribs and planking. The cork was still there. It was saturated with water now, but it was still there, and it was still providing buoyancy. Even with her bilge flooded, even with her lower decks awash, the Joyita was effectively unsinkable. She could not have gone down. She should not have been abandoned. Williams turned this fact over in his mind, and he did not like what it implied. If the ship could not sink, why had everyone left her? The answer, according to the first inquiry's preliminary findings, was panic. Untrained passengers, unfamiliar with the sea, had felt the ship listing and had assumed the worst. They had demanded the lifeboats be launched. Captain Miller, unable to calm them, had complied. The boats had been launched into open ocean, overloaded and under-provisioned, and had been swamped or lost in the swells. The passengers had drowned. The crew had drowned. Everyone had drowned, within hours of abandoning a ship that would have carried them safely to port if only they had stayed aboard. It was a tidy explanation. It made sense, after a fashion. It assigned blame to panic and ignorance rather than to any systemic failure or criminal act. Williams seemed inclined to accept it, but there were problems. The blood, for one. If the ship had been abandoned in a panic, in a desperate rush for the lifeboats, why was there blood on the deck? And not just blood, bandages, medical supplies, a doctor's bag, open and scattered. Someone had been treating an injury. Someone had been trying to save a life. That did not suggest panic. That suggested something else entirely. And then there was the matter of the missing cargo. The 44 fuel drums were gone. The timber was gone. The food was gone. If the ship had been abandoned in a panic, who had taken the time to load cargo into the lifeboats, and why? Fuel drums are not useful in a life raft. Timber is not food. The cargo's disappearance suggested planning, not panic. Suggested, perhaps, that the evacuation had not been an evacuation at all. Williams asked questions. The answers he received were unsatisfying. The inquiry dragged on, witness after witness, detail after contradictory detail, until finally, in February of 1956, he issued his preliminary findings. The Joyita, Williams concluded, had been lost due to a combination of misfortune and misadventure. The precise cause of the abandonment could not be determined. The fate of the passengers and crew remained unknown. No criminal act was suspected. The case was closed. The families of the missing did not accept this. The government of Western Samoa did not accept this. The newspapers certainly did not accept this. Within months, a second inquiry was convened, this time in Apia, with a new investigator and a mandate to dig deeper. And this is where the story begins to fracture. This is where the contradictions pile up, where the testimony conflicts, where the official version of events stops making sense and something darker starts to emerge. The second inquiry would uncover evidence that the first had missed or ignored. It would raise questions about Captain Miller's debts, about the first mate's past, about what really happened in those hours between the Joyita's departure and her discovery. It would find threads that, if pulled, might unravel the entire official narrative. But those threads, once pulled, led into shadows that no one wanted to enter. Captain Thomas Henry Miller was an American citizen who had remade himself in the Pacific. He was born in California in 1902, served in the United States Navy during the First World War, and then, for reasons that are not entirely clear, emigrated to Britain in the early 1920s. There he reinvented himself as an Englishman, adopting the accent, the mannerisms, the naval traditions of his adopted country. He served in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve between the wars, rose to the rank of Lieutenant Commander, and might have lived out his life as a respectable member of the British establishment if the Second World War had not shattered that trajectory. The details of Miller's war service are murky. What is clear is that he emerged from it changed, harder, more restless, less willing to submit to the constraints of civilian life in post-war Britain. In 1947, he accepted a position as a harbour pilot in Apia, Western Samoa, and sailed away from everything he had known. In Samoa, Miller found something like peace. The pace of life suited him, the weather suited him, the ocean suited him, and he spent his spare hours sailing the island waters in borrowed boats, learning the currents and the reefs, absorbing the knowledge that would eventually make him one of the most trusted captains in the territory. When the Joyita came up for sale in 1953, Miller saw an opportunity. The ship was old but sound, and she had a reputation. She had once belonged to a Hollywood film director named Roland West, who had used her for parties and weekend cruises, who had spared no expense in fitting her out. Miller borrowed money from everyone who would lend it to him, the bank, his friends, his employer. He bought the Joyita for what seemed like a reasonable sum and set himself up as a charter captain. The business failed almost immediately. The Joyita was too expensive to operate. Her engines drank fuel at a rate that Miller could not sustain. Her maintenance costs were ruinous. The tropical climate ate away at her woodwork, and every repair revealed another repair that needed to be made. The charter work was irregular, and the fees were low, and within 18 months Miller was drowning in debt. By October of 1955, his creditors had begun to close in. He owed money to at least 5 different entities: the bank that held the mortgage on the ship, a fuel company that had extended him credit, 2 private lenders who had trusted his good name, and the Samoan government itself, which had advanced him funds against future charter fees that never materialized. He was juggling payments, making promises he could not keep, living on the edge of financial collapse. The charter to Tokelau represented a lifeline. The fee was modest, a few £100s paid by the colonial administration for the transport of cargo and personnel, but it was guaranteed, and it would buy Miller time to find more work, to stave off the creditors for another month, to keep the Joyita afloat in every sense of the word. This is the context in which Captain Miller made his final voyage. This is the weight he was carrying when he stood at the Joyita's wheel and watched Apia harbour recede behind him. He was a man at the end of his rope, sailing a ship he could not afford into an ocean that would not give him back. And he was not alone in his desperation. The second inquiry uncovered something that the first had missed. In the weeks before the Joyita's departure, Miller had been seeking investors for a new business venture. The details of this venture are unclear, the records are fragmentary, and the witnesses' memories were uncertain, but it appears to have involved the transport of cargo that did not appear on any manifest. One witness testified that Miller had approached him about a special shipment that would need to be delivered quietly to the Tokelau Islands. Another witness, a customs officer, reported that Miller had asked about the procedures for transporting goods without a formal declaration. A third witness, this one less reliable, a dock worker with a reputation for gossip, claimed that Miller had been meeting with Japanese fishing boat captains in the weeks before the voyage, that money had changed hands, that something was being planned. None of this could be verified, none of it could be disproved. The second inquiry noted the testimony, flagged it as requiring further investigation, and moved on. But the implication hung in the air like the smell of copra on the Apia wharf. What if the Joyita had been carrying something other than what the manifest said? What if her cargo hold had contained more than fuel drums and medical supplies? What if Captain Miller's desperation had led him into something darker than mere financial trouble? The inquiry found no evidence of contraband. It found no evidence of smuggling, of piracy, of any criminal conspiracy. What it found was a bankrupt captain, a damaged ship, and 25 people who had vanished without a trace. The second inquiry closed in July of 1956, its conclusions essentially identical to the first. Misfortune and misadventure, cause unknown, fate of passengers and crew undetermined. The case file was archived. The Joyita was sold at auction to a new owner who promised to restore her. The families of the missing were left with their grief and their unanswered questions. But the questions refused to stay buried. They would surface again in newspaper articles, in radio broadcasts, in books and documentaries, and late-night conversations among people who could not stop thinking about the ship that sailed into the Pacific and never came back. And then, in 1962, 7 years after the disaster, a man walked into a newspaper office in Auckland and claimed that he knew what had happened. He claimed that he had been there. He claimed that he was the only survivor. His story would change everything and explain nothing. His name was Ronald James DeVere, and he was not what the editors of the Auckland Star had expected. They had expected perhaps a sailor, a weathered man with calloused hands and the squint of someone who had spent years watching horizons. They had expected, if they were honest with themselves, someone who looked like a survivor, gaunt, haunted, bearing the visible weight of whatever horror had claimed 24 of his companions. What they got instead was a neatly dressed man in his early 40s, clean-shaven, soft-spoken, with the demeanour of a bank clerk or a minor civil servant. He sat in the reception area of the newspaper office with his hat in his lap, waiting patiently, as if he had come to inquire about a classified advertisement, rather than to crack open the most baffling maritime mystery in the South Pacific. The reporter who took the initial interview was a junior man named Peter Caldwell. He would later describe DeVere as utterly unremarkable in appearance, and absolutely unshakable in his conviction. DeVere spoke for nearly 2 hours that first afternoon, and Caldwell filled an entire notebook with his account. The story DeVere told was specific, detailed, internally consistent, and almost entirely impossible to verify. According to DeVere, he had been a passenger on the Joyita, not listed on the manifest because he had boarded at the last minute, a favour from Captain Miller, whom he claimed to have known from the war. He said he had served with Miller in the Pacific, that they had remained friends, that Miller had agreed to take him along to the Tokelau Islands, where DeVere hoped to find work with the copra traders. The voyage had begun normally, DeVere said. The weather was fair, the sea calm, the passengers in good spirits. Then, on the second night out from Apia, everything changed. DeVere claimed that the Joyita had encountered a vessel, not a storm, not mechanical failure, but another ship. He described it as a fishing boat, large, crewed by Japanese or possibly Japanese-speaking men. The encounter had been peaceful at first. The fishing boat had hailed the Joyita, requested permission to come alongside, claimed to be in need of fresh water. Captain Miller, according to DeVere, had been suspicious but ultimately agreed. The code of the sea, the obligation to assist a vessel in distress overriding his instincts. The men from the fishing boat had come aboard, and then, without warning, they had produced weapons. What followed, in DeVere's telling, was a brief and brutal struggle. The passengers and crew of the Joyita were overwhelmed within minutes. Some resisted. DeVere named the doctor, a man called Parsons, as one who had fought back before being struck down with a blow to the head. Others complied, hoping that cooperation would spare their lives. It did not. One by one, according to DeVere, the people aboard the Joyita were taken onto the fishing boat. DeVere himself had been below decks when the attack began, had hidden in a forward storage compartment, had remained there in terrified silence while he listened to the sounds of violence above him. He claimed to have stayed hidden for hours, long after the fishing boat had departed. When he finally emerged, he found the Joyita abandoned, listing badly, taking on water. He found bloodstains on the deck. He found the doctor's bag left behind in the struggle, its contents scattered. He found Captain Miller's logbook, the logbook that would later be missing, and he claimed to have read the final entries, which described the approach of an unidentified vessel and Miller's growing unease. De Vere said he had been too terrified to stay aboard the sinking ship. He had inflated one of the life rafts, had taken what supplies he could find, had set himself adrift in the open ocean. And here the story became both more vivid and less credible. De Vere claimed to have drifted for 11 days. He described the sun beating down on him, the thirst that drove him to drink seawater, the hallucinations that came in waves. He described seeing land on the 4th day and paddling toward it, only to have it recede into the mist, a mirage, a trick of his desperate mind. He described the birds that circled his raft, the sharks that followed in his wake, the moment when he had given up hope and prepared to die. And then, on the 11th day, he had been picked up by a trading vessel, making the run between Fiji and Tonga. The crew had nursed him back to health, had delivered him to Suva, had asked no questions when he gave a false name, and disappeared into the anonymity of the colonial port town. Why, the reporter asked, had he not come forward immediately? Why had he waited 7 years to tell this story? De Vere's answer was both simple and unsatisfying. He said he had been afraid. He said he believed the men who had attacked the Joyita were pirates, that they had connections throughout the Pacific, that they would kill him if they learned he had survived. He said he had spent 7 years looking over his shoulder, 7 years building a new life under a new name, 7 years trying to forget what he had seen. But the guilt had become too much. The faces of the dead visited him in his dreams. Captain Miller, who had befriended him, the doctor who had fought so bravely, the women and children who had done nothing to deserve their fate. De Vere said he owed them the truth, even if the truth could not bring them back. The Auckland Star ran the story on its front page. The headline was appropriately sensational. "I survived the Joyita. Passenger reveals pirate attack after 7 years of silence." The article was reprinted in newspapers across New Zealand, Australia and the Pacific Islands. Within days, Ronald de Vere had become the most famous man in the South Pacific, and the investigation into the Joyita's fate had been reopened for the 3rd time. The 3rd inquiry convened in Wellington in the spring of 1962, its mandate narrow but urgent: determine the credibility of Ronald James de Vere's account, and if credible, identify the parties responsible for the attack and disappearance of 25 British and Western Samoan subjects. From the beginning, the inquiry faced a fundamental problem. De Vere's story was detailed enough to be plausible and vague enough to be unfalsifiable. He claimed to have been a last-minute addition to the passenger list, which explained why his name appeared on no manifest. He claimed to have been rescued by a trading vessel, whose crew he could not identify, and delivered to a port where he had assumed a false identity. He claimed to have read Captain Miller's logbook, but the logbook had disappeared, taken presumably by the pirates, or lost when the Joyita was found, or perhaps never existing in the first place. Every piece of evidence that might have confirmed or denied his account was conveniently absent. The inquiry began by attempting to verify the basic facts of de Vere's biography. This proved almost immediately difficult. De Vere claimed to have served in the Pacific during the war, but the military records held no trace of a Ronald James de Vere matching his description. He claimed to have known Captain Miller for years, but none of Miller's surviving friends or family members recognized the name or the face. He claimed to have lived in Suva for 7 years after his rescue, but the Fiji colonial records contained no evidence of his residence. No work permits, no lease agreements, no hospital visits, no interactions with officialdom of any kind. When pressed on these discrepancies, de Vere remained calm and consistent. He explained that he had served under a different name, a common enough practice during the war, particularly for men with complicated pasts. He explained that his friendship with Miller had been private, that they had met in circumstances neither man had wished to publicise. He explained that his 7 years in Fiji had been spent deliberately avoiding the notice of authorities, living on the margins, paying in cash, trusting no one. The explanations were not implausible. They were simply impossible to confirm. The inquiry then turned to the physical evidence, such as it was. The Joyita, by 1962, had passed through multiple owners and undergone extensive repairs. The bloodstains De Vere described had long since been scrubbed away or painted over. The doctor's bag had been catalogued by the first inquiry, but the bandages and medical supplies had been disposed of years ago. The deck where the struggle supposedly took place had been refinished. The storage compartment where De Vere claimed to have hidden was unchanged, but there was nothing there to suggest he had ever occupied it. No personal effects, no markings, no evidence of any kind. The investigators did manage to locate and interview some of the crewmen who had discovered the drifting Joyita in 1955. Their testimony was consistent with the original inquiry. They had found no survivors aboard, no bodies, no life rafts. If De Vere had escaped on a raft, he would have had to launch it before the ship was discovered, which meant the Joyita would have been crewed by ghosts for the 5 weeks between her departure and her finding. This raised a question the inquiry could not answer. If everyone had abandoned ship early in the voyage, as De Vere's story implied, what had kept the Joyita afloat? Who had set the radio to the distress frequency? Who had arranged the cargo in the strange, careful manner described by the salvage crew? The inquiry also investigated the alleged rescue vessel. De Vere had described it as a trading schooner, crewed by Fijians, making a regular run between island groups. He had described the captain as an elderly man with a white beard and a wooden leg, a detail so colourful it seemed almost designed to be remembered. The investigators checked the shipping records for the Fiji-Tonga route in October and November of 1955. They found dozens of vessels that might have matched De Vere's description. They tracked down crews, questioned captains, examined logbooks. None of them reported rescuing a castaway in the relevant time period. None of them recalled a desperate sunburned man pulled from a life raft in the open ocean. If such a rescue had occurred, it had left no trace in the official record. The inquiry pressed De Vere for more details. Could he describe the fishing boat that had attacked the Joyita? Could he identify any of the men who had boarded? Could he explain precisely how the attack had unfolded? Who had been taken first? Who had resisted? Where the bodies had been disposed of? De Vere's answers grew less certain as the questions became more specific. He described the fishing boat as large, 60 feet or more, with a high bow and a crowded deck. He described the attackers as Japanese, or possibly Chinese, or possibly Filipino. Oriental, he said, which was not particularly helpful. He described the attack itself as chaotic, confusing, over before he had time to understand what was happening. He had not seen bodies being disposed of because he had been hiding in the storage compartment. He had not seen the fishing boat depart because he had been too terrified to move. He had not kept the logbook because it had seemed too dangerous to carry evidence of what had happened. The investigators began to notice a pattern in De Vere's testimony. When asked about general impressions, the feeling of the attack, the terror of the aftermath, the desperation of his time adrift, he was vivid and persuasive, almost poetic in his descriptions. When asked about specific, verifiable details, names, dates, physical characteristics, locations, he became vague, uncertain, contradictory. He seemed to remember emotions perfectly and facts hardly at all. The third inquiry lasted for 4 months. It interviewed dozens of witnesses, reviewed thousands of pages of documents, and spent considerable effort trying to establish the basic truth of Ronald De Vere's account. In the end, it could neither confirm nor deny his story. The investigators noted that his description of the Joyita's condition was broadly consistent with the reports from the salvage crew. They noted that his account of Captain Miller's character and circumstances aligned with what was known from other sources. They noted that his story, while impossible to prove, was not technically impossible. But they also noted the troubling absence of corroborating evidence. They noted the convenient gaps in his biography. They noted the melodramatic details, the captain with the wooden leg, the 11 days adrift, the 7 years of hiding, that seemed borrowed from adventure novels rather than lived experience. And they noted, with considerable frustration, that De Vere had emerged at a moment when the Joyita case was once again in the news, when a best-selling book about the mystery had reignited public interest, when a survivor's story would be worth a great deal of money to the right publisher. The third inquiry closed in August of 1962 with a verdict that satisfied no one. Ronald James De Vere's account could not be verified, but it could not be definitively disproved. The inquiry recommended that the case remain open pending the emergence of new evidence. It recommended that authorities in the Pacific region be alerted to the possibility of piracy, though it acknowledged that the alleged perpetrators, if they existed, had long since vanished into the vastness of the ocean. It recommended that the families of the missing be informed of De Vere's claims, though it cautioned that these claims should be treated with appropriate skepticism. The newspapers naturally treated them with no skepticism at all. De Vere's story became the accepted explanation for the Joyita disaster in the popular imagination. Books were written, documentaries were filmed. His account was repeated so often that it acquired the solidity of established fact. The Pirates of the Pacific, the hidden cargo, the lone survivor drifting for 11 days under the merciless sun, this was the story people wanted to hear, and so this was the story that endured. De Vere himself profited handsomely from his account. He sold his story to a major Australian publisher, gave paid lectures throughout New Zealand and Australia, consulted on a proposed feature film that was never made. He lived comfortably on the proceeds for the rest of his life, maintaining until his death in 1978 that every word he had spoken was true. But doubts persisted. Journalists who investigated his background found no trace of him before 1962. The military records, the shipping records, the colonial archives, none of them contained a Ronald James De Vere who matched the man who had walked into the Auckland Star offices that spring day. It was as if he had materialised from nothing, fully formed, with a story ready to tell. In 1975, 3 years before his death, a researcher named Margaret Chen undertook a comprehensive investigation of the De Vere claims. Chen was a librarian at the University of Auckland, a careful, methodical woman with a passion for maritime history and a deep skepticism of sensational narratives. She spent 2 years tracking down every verifiable detail of De Vere's account, cross-referencing his statements with surviving records, interviewing anyone who might have had contact with him before or after his public emergence. Her findings were damning. She discovered that a man matching De Vere's description had been treated for alcoholism at a hospital in Sydney in 1960, under a different name. She discovered that this same man had been briefly employed as a clerk at a shipping company, where he would have had access to detailed information about Pacific trade routes, vessel types, and maritime procedures. She discovered that he had been dismissed from this position for irregularities, involving expense reports and forged documentation. She discovered that he had spent time in prison in 1958 for fraud, specifically for impersonating a war veteran to obtain benefits he was not entitled to. Chen also discovered something that had not been reported at the time of the third inquiry. In early 1962, just weeks before De Vere appeared at the Auckland Star, a book titled The Mystery of the Joyita had been published in London. The book was a popular account of the disaster, well-researched and vividly written, drawing on the testimony from the first 2 inquiries and on interviews with surviving family members. The book contained detailed descriptions of Captain Miller, of the Joyita's condition when found, of the theories that had been proposed to explain the disappearance. It contained, in other words, everything a clever man would need to construct a plausible survivor's account. Chen never published her findings. She completed her research, assembled her notes, and then, for reasons she never explained, set the project aside. The notes were discovered among her papers after her death in 1991, donated to the university library, and largely forgotten until a graduate student rediscovered them in 2004. By then, De Vere had been dead for decades. The original inquiry documents had been scattered across multiple archives, and the families of the missing had mostly passed away, taking their memories and their suspicions with them. The 4th and final inquiry into the Joyita disaster was not a formal government investigation. It was a private effort, funded by the descendants of one of the passengers, a man named Tekau Tuitavake, who'd been 32 years old when he disappeared, a husband and father of 3, a village leader from the island of Savaii. Tuitavake's grandson, a successful businessman in Auckland, had never accepted the official verdict of cause unknown. He had spent years collecting documents, interviewing aging witnesses, trying to understand what had happened to his grandfather on that October voyage. In 2008, he hired a maritime investigation firm to conduct a comprehensive review of all available evidence. The firm was based in Singapore, staffed by former naval officers and insurance investigators, specialists in the kind of meticulous reconstruction that official inquiries rarely had the time or resources to perform. They worked for 18 months, and their final report, delivered in early 2010, ran to over 400 pages. The report systematically dismantled both the official verdicts and the popular mythology. It found no evidence to support De Vere's piracy account, which it characterised as almost certainly fabricated based on published sources. it found significant flaws in the original inquiry's conclusions about weather and mechanical failure, and it proposed a new explanation, one that had been suggested in fragments before but never fully developed, one that fit the available evidence better than any alternative, one that was, in its own way, more disturbing than any tale of pirates or secret cargo. The Singapore report began with the auxiliary engine. The second inquiry had noted the disconnected pipe and the flooded bilge, had attributed the damage to rough weather or perhaps sabotage. The Singapore investigators took a different view. They examined the technical specifications of the Joyita's engine room, the maintenance records that had survived, the testimony of mechanics who had worked on similar vessels. They concluded that the pipe had not been disconnected by external force. It had been deliberately removed, probably by Captain Miller himself. The reason, according to the report, was simple. The auxiliary engine was not working. It had not been working for weeks before the voyage, perhaps longer. The record showed that Miller had requested repairs multiple times, had been denied funding by the ship's owners, had attempted makeshift fixes that had repeatedly failed. By the time the Joyita left Apia, the auxiliary engine was useless, a dead weight in the engine room, consuming space and fuel and contributing nothing. Miller, desperate to extract every possible hour of operation from his crippled vessel, had disconnected the pipe to isolate the auxiliary system and redirect cooling water to the main engine. This was not in itself unreasonable. It was the kind of improvised repair that experienced captains made all the time, especially in the cash-strapped world of island trading vessels. But it had a consequence that Miller may not have anticipated. The disconnected pipe, according to the Singapore report, created a pathway for seawater to enter the hull below the waterline. The entry was slow at first, a trickle, easily handled by the bilge pumps. But over time, as the Joyita laboured through the swells, the pathway widened. The trickle became a stream. The stream became a flood. The report estimated that the Joyita began taking on water approximately 18 hours after leaving Apia, around midday on October 4th, roughly 200 miles from her destination. At this point, Captain Miller faced a decision. He could turn back towards Samoa, 8 to 10 hours away, and hope the pumps could keep pace with the flooding, or he could continue toward Tokelau, slightly closer but requiring passage through waters with fewer opportunities for rescue if the situation deteriorated. According to the report, Miller chose neither. Instead, he did something that explained both the drifting course and the missing passengers. The report proposed that Miller had decided to make for Fiji. The reasoning was grimly logical. In Samoa, Miller faced creditors, lawsuits, the potential seizure of his ship. In Tokelau, he faced a colonial administration that had already expressed dissatisfaction with his services. But in Fiji, he had contacts, possibly friends, perhaps even the possibility of selling the Joyita and starting fresh. The journey was longer, 400 miles or more, but the Joyita was unsinkable, everyone said so. Her cork-lined hull would keep her afloat even if the pumps failed entirely. Miller could nurse his wounded vessel across the Pacific, make landfall in Fiji, and begin again. This theory explained the course. The Joyita was found 600 miles off her original heading, drifting northwest toward Fiji. A deliberate course change would account for this trajectory far more neatly than random drift from a disabled vessel. But it did not explain the missing people. The Singapore report addressed this question with a careful reconstruction of what might have happened over the next several days. The flooding continued. The pumps failed or were overwhelmed. The Joyita settled lower in the water, her deck awash, her superstructure the only part remaining above the waves. Panic set in among the passengers. The life rafts were launched. People abandoned ship, convinced that the vessel was sinking, unaware that her cork hull would keep her floating indefinitely. The report found evidence to support this scenario in the condition of the Joyita when discovered. The superstructure was relatively undamaged, suggesting no violent struggle or storm damage. The cargo had been rearranged, with heavier items moved to the stern, consistent with an effort to trim the vessel and keep her bow from dipping below the waterline. The life rafts were gone, the davits empty. Someone had launched them deliberately, which meant someone had chosen to abandon a floating ship for the uncertainty of the open ocean. Why would anyone make such a choice? The report speculated that Captain Miller's authority had collapsed. The passengers, many of them Samoans with extensive ocean experience, had seen their vessel sinking lower by the hour, had seen the pumps failing, had lost confidence in the white captain who had promised to deliver them safely, and had instead led them into a waterlogged nightmare. A mutiny of sorts, perhaps, or simply a collective decision to take their chances on the rafts rather than ride a foundering ship into the depths. The report was careful to note that this was speculation. There was no direct evidence of what had happened to the 25 people who had been aboard the Joyita. No bodies had ever been recovered, no rafts had ever washed ashore, no trace of them had ever been found, despite extensive searches in the weeks after the disaster and periodic sweeps in the years that followed. But the report offered a grim statistical reality. The Pacific is vast beyond comprehension. A life raft adrift in those waters has almost no chance of being spotted by passing vessels. The currents run in unpredictable directions. The sun is merciless. The water is undrinkable. A group of people in overloaded rafts without navigation equipment, without reliable supplies, without communication, they would have drifted until they died. Exposure, dehydration, starvation. One by one, they would have succumbed, and the ocean would have taken their remains. The families who had funded the investigation received their answer, though it was not the answer they had hoped for. There had been no pirates. There had been no smuggling. There had been no dramatic struggle against villains or nature. There had only been a desperate captain, a damaged ship, and a series of decisions that led inexorably toward catastrophe. Tekau Tuitavake had likely drowned somewhere in the open Pacific, far from land, surrounded by people he knew, watching the horizon for a rescue that never came. His body had been consumed by the sea, returned to the depths, never to be found. The Singapore report was never officially adopted by any government inquiry. It remained a private document, shared among the families, cited occasionally by researchers, largely unknown to the general public. The popular version of the Joyita story, pirates, intrigue, the lone survivor's dramatic account, continued to dominate the books and documentaries and late-night conversations. People preferred the mystery to the explanation. They preferred the romance of the unknown to the banality of mechanical failure and human error. But for those who looked closely, the Singapore report offered something the other accounts could not. It offered plausibility. It offered logic. It offered an explanation that did not require hidden cargoes or international conspiracies or lone survivors emerging from 7 years of silence. It offered, in other words, the truth, or the closest approximation of truth that would ever be possible, given the vast and patient ocean that had swallowed the evidence along with the dead. And still, even now, the questions remain. What was the bloodied bandage doing aboard? Whose blood had soaked through the gauze, and what wound had required the doctor's attention in those final desperate hours? Why had the radio been set to a distress frequency that no one monitored? A frequency so obscure that rescue ships would have had to tune specifically to hear it. A frequency that seemed almost designed to fail. What had Captain Miller been thinking in those last moments, as his ship settled lower and his passengers launched themselves into the abyss? Had he gone with them, accepting at last that his gamble had failed? Or had he stayed aboard, clinging to the vessel that had ruined him, watching them paddle away into the darkness? The Joyita herself survived. She was pulled from the water, repaired, sold, repaired again. She passed through a succession of owners, each one hoping to profit from her notoriety, each one eventually abandoning her to rot at various Pacific wharves. In the 1970s, she was used briefly as a floating restaurant. In the 1980s, she served as a dive platform for tourists who paid to snorkel where 25 people had vanished. By the 1990s, she had deteriorated beyond practical use, her hull riddled with rot, her superstructure sagging, her cork lining waterlogged and useless. She was last reported beached on a reef near Levuka, Fiji in 1999, a ghost ship at last, stripped of her fittings, her nameplate stolen by souvenir hunters, her decks open to the sky. Whether she still lies there or whether the Pacific has finally claimed her entirely, no one seems to know for certain. The official inquiries, when they finally concluded, satisfied no one. There were 4 of them in total, spread across 18 months. A colonial commission in Fiji, a maritime board in Western Samoa, a New Zealand Admiralty review prompted by Captain Miller's nationality, and a British consular investigation triggered by the presence of 2 UK subjects among the missing. Each inquiry operated under different jurisdictions, different evidentiary standards, different institutional pressures. Each inquiry reached different conclusions, and each inquiry, in its own way, failed to answer the question that the families and the press and the haunted public actually wanted answered. What happened to the people? The Fiji inquiry was the first to convene, barely 3 weeks after the Joyita was towed into Suva harbour. The timing was driven by political pressure. The Colonial Office in London had received pointed questions from members of Parliament about the fate of British subjects in Pacific waters, and the Fiji administration was anxious to demonstrate that it was taking the matter seriously. The commissioners were local officials, men who understood the practical realities of island shipping, but who had little experience with maritime casualties on this scale. They examined the salvaged vessel. They interviewed the tow crew, the harbour master, the engineers who had inspected the hull. They reviewed Captain Miller's personnel file, his medical history, his financial records. And they concluded, after 3 weeks of testimony and deliberation, that the Joyita had been rendered unseaworthy by mechanical failure, that the passengers and crew had abandoned ship in circumstances of extreme emergency, and that their fate remained unknown. The verdict was a masterpiece of bureaucratic evasion. It assigned no blame, it identified no cause, it answered no questions. It simply restated in formal legal language what everyone already knew. The ship had broken down, the people had left, and no one had seen them since. The Western Samoan inquiry, which convened 2 months later, took a harder line. The Samoan authorities had lost 9 of their own citizens aboard the Joyita. Government officials, medical personnel, teachers bound for the outer islands. The political pressure there was more acute, the public anger more palpable. The commissioners were not inclined toward diplomatic vagueness. They wanted to know why the ship had been allowed to sail in the first place, who had certified her seaworthy, who had approved the passenger manifest, who had signed off on the cargo loading that had left her riding low in the water before she ever cleared the harbour. The Samoan inquiry focused its attention on the port authorities in Apia, and what it found was not flattering. The Joyita had been operating without a valid survey certificate for nearly 2 years. Her radio equipment had failed an inspection in 1954 and had never been properly repaired. Her crew were undermanned and undertrained. Several of the Gilles Baptiste sailors spoke no English, and at least 2 had never served on a vessel larger than a fishing outrigger. The lifeboat davits had been flagged as defective in 1953 and had not been replaced. The inquiry discovered that the harbour master who had cleared the Joyita for departure had a financial relationship with one of the cargo owners and had waived the normal inspection protocols as a personal favour. The Samoan commissioners issued a scathing report. They blamed the colonial administration for regulatory failures, the Port Authority for corruption, and Captain Miller for recklessness. They recommended criminal charges against the harbour master. They called for an overhaul of maritime safety standards throughout the territory. They demanded compensation for the families of the Samoan dead. None of these recommendations were implemented. The harbour master resigned quietly and relocated to New Zealand. The safety reforms were tabled pending further study. The compensation claims were denied on jurisdictional grounds. The ship had been registered in Fiji. The voyage had departed from Samoa. The owner was a British national, and no single authority was willing to accept liability. The families received nothing but a formal expression of condolence from the High Commissioner's office. The New Zealand inquiry, which ran concurrently with the Samoan investigation, reached entirely different conclusions. The New Zealand commissioners had no interest in blaming colonial bureaucracies or protecting local officials. Their concern was Captain Miller, a New Zealand citizen, a decorated war veteran, a man whose reputation was now being posthumously shredded by foreign commissions. The New Zealand Maritime Board reviewed Miller's service record, his training certificates, his previous commands. They interviewed his former colleagues, his wartime superiors, the officers who had served with him during his years with the Royal New Zealand Navy. They painted a picture of a competent, experienced seaman who had been placed in an impossible situation by circumstances beyond his control. The New Zealand report concluded that the Joyita had suffered catastrophic mechanical failure due to factors that could not have been anticipated or prevented by her master. It noted that Miller had remained aboard the vessel after the passengers evacuated, the only inquiry to make this claim explicitly, and had likely gone down with his ship in the finest traditions of maritime duty. It exonerated him of any negligence and recommended that his name be added to the roll of honour maintained by the Royal New Zealand Naval Association. The recommendation was approved. Captain Thomas Henry Miller's name was inscribed on a brass plaque in Wellington, alongside the names of sailors who had died in combat. His family received a letter of commendation from the Minister of Defence. His widow was granted a small pension. Meanwhile, the Samoan inquiry was calling him a reckless incompetent who had killed 24 people through greed and bad judgment. The British consular investigation, the final of the 4, attempted to reconcile these contradictions. The British consul in Fiji had been receiving pointed inquiries from London about the deaths of 2 British subjects, a retired civil servant named Gilbert Williams and his wife Edith, who had been returning to England after 30 years in the Pacific colonies. The Williamses had children in Surrey who wanted to know what had happened to their parents, and their Member of Parliament was making increasingly hostile noises about colonial incompetence and administrative neglect. The consular investigation was the most thorough of the 4, and the most frustrating. The investigators had access to all the evidence gathered by the other inquiries, plus additional materials that had been withheld from the colonial commissions, including Captain Miller's personal correspondence, his bank records, and a series of letters he'd written to creditors in the months before the voyage. They had the private report from Singapore, which had not been shared with the other inquiries. They had statements from witnesses who had refused to cooperate with the colonial authorities, but who were willing to speak to British officials. What they found was a tangle of contradictions that no single explanation could resolve. The engineering evidence suggested multiple simultaneous failures: the cooling pipe fracture, the auxiliary pump malfunction, the electrical short that had disabled the bilge pumps. Any one of these failures, alone, would have been manageable. Together, they had created a cascading catastrophe that had overwhelmed the crew's ability to respond. But the engineers could not agree on the sequence. Had the cooling pipe failed first, causing the engine to overheat and triggering the electrical fire that disabled the pumps? Or had the electrical failure come first, knocking out the pumps and allowing water to rise until it reached the engine mounts and caused the fracture? The physical evidence was ambiguous. The corrosion patterns suggested both sequences were possible. The investigators could not determine with any confidence which system had failed first. The medical evidence was equally confusing. The bloodied bandages found aboard suggested that someone had been seriously injured. The volume of blood, according to the medical examiner who analysed the stains, was consistent with a major wound, possibly a deep laceration or a compound fracture. Dr. Parsons' medical bag had been found open, with several instruments missing and others scattered across the deck. But whose blood was it? No bodies had been recovered. No passenger or crew member had been identified as injured before the voyage began. The manifest listed no medical emergencies. Someone had been hurt badly enough to require emergency treatment, but there was no record of who, or how, or when. The consular investigators interviewed the families of the passengers, looking for any hint of pre-existing medical conditions that might explain the blood. They found nothing. Tekau Tuitaveki had been in perfect health when he boarded. So had the Williams couple. So had the Samoan officials and the teachers and the Gilbertese crewmen. Someone had been hurt aboard the Joyita, hurt badly, and no one knew who. The radio evidence was perhaps the strangest of all. The Joyita's radio had been found tuned to 2,182 kHz, the international distress frequency, the one frequency that every vessel in the Pacific was supposed to monitor. But the transmitter itself had been set to a different frequency entirely, 500 kHz, the old merchant marine calling frequency that had been phased out of common use years earlier. It was as if someone had tried to send a distress signal, but had accidentally, or deliberately, chosen a channel that no one was listening to. The investigators consulted with radio engineers in Sydney, trying to understand how such a mismatch could have occurred. The engineers explained that the Joyita's radio equipment was outdated, poorly maintained, and notoriously difficult to operate. The frequency selectors were worn and prone to slippage. It was entirely possible that someone in a moment of panic had set the receiver correctly but fumbled the transmitter settings, sending their cries for help into a void. But it was also possible that the settings had been deliberately manipulated, that someone had wanted the distress signal to fail, had wanted the Joyita to drift unheard, until whatever had happened aboard was finished. The consular report, when it was finally issued in late 1956, ran to over 400 pages. It reviewed every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every theory that had been proposed, and it concluded, after all that effort, that the fate of the Joyita's passengers and crew could not be determined with certainty. The report acknowledged that mechanical failure was the most likely proximate cause of the disaster. It acknowledged that the passengers had probably evacuated the vessel voluntarily, believing it was about to sink. It acknowledged that the evacuation had probably failed, that the lifeboats or rafts had proven inadequate, that the passengers had succumbed to exposure or drowning, that their bodies had been lost to the Pacific. But it could not rule out other possibilities. It could not explain the blood. It could not explain the radio settings. It could not account for the missing logbook, which might have contained a record of everything that had happened in those final hours. The report recommended that the case remain open pending the discovery of new evidence. It expressed hope that bodies or wreckage might eventually wash ashore, providing answers that the investigation had been unable to supply. It offered condolences to the families of the deceased. No bodies ever washed ashore, no wreckage was ever found. The case was never officially closed, but no new evidence ever emerged. The four inquiries, contradicting each other, blaming each other, reaching conclusions that could not be reconciled, became the official record, and the official record explained nothing. The families of the dead were left with legal documents instead of answers, bureaucratic verdicts instead of closure. Gilbert and Edith Williams' children in Surrey received a death certificate issued by the British consul in Fiji, listing the cause of death as lost at sea, circumstances unknown. Tekau Tuitavek's mother in Western Samoa received a similar document from the Samoan administration. Captain Miller's widow in Auckland received her pension and her letter of commendation, and the knowledge that her husband had either died a hero or a fool, depending on which government's report you believed. The insurance claims took years to resolve. Lloyd's of London initially refused to pay out on the cargo policies, arguing that the circumstances of the loss were too suspicious to qualify for coverage. The cargo owners sued. The case dragged through the courts until 1959, when a compromise settlement was finally reached. The families of the passengers received nothing. There had been no life insurance policies in force, and the maritime law of the period did not recognise claims for wrongful death against a vessel's owner when the cause of death could not be determined. The Joyita herself had been sold by then, passed through 3 owners in rapid succession, each one hoping to profit from her notoriety, and each one discovering that notoriety alone does not pay docking fees. She sat in Suva harbour for months at a time, taking on water, her pumps running constantly, her cork-lined hull slowly rotting from the inside. The tourists who came to see the famous ghost ship found a sad, neglected vessel that smelled of mildew and diesel fuel, her paint peeling, her brass fittings green with corrosion. She was not a mystery. She was just a boat that no one wanted anymore. And then, in 1962, 7 years after the Joyita had been found drifting and empty, a man walked into the offices of the Pacific Islands Monthly magazine in Sydney and announced that he had survived the disaster. His name was Robin Morgan. Not his real name, as it turned out, but the name he had adopted years earlier during what he described as a complicated period in his life. He was in his late 40s, weather-beaten and gaunt, with the look of someone who had spent too many years in tropical climates drinking too much and eating too little. He spoke with an accent that shifted between Australian and something else, something harder to place. He chain-smoked local cigarettes and asked repeatedly whether the magazine would be willing to pay for his story. The editors were sceptical but intrigued. They had been covering the Joyita story since 1955, had written dozens of articles about the mystery, had interviewed everyone who had ever claimed to know anything about what had happened. They had never heard of Robin Morgan. They asked him to prove his identity. He could not, or would not. He said his documents had been lost years ago, during a period when he had been moving frequently to avoid certain parties who did not wish him well. He said he could describe the Joyita in detail that only someone who had been aboard would know. He said he could name the passengers and crew, could describe their faces, could recount conversations he had overheard during the voyage. He said he knew what had happened during those 5 days between Apia and the discovery of the drifting vessel, and he was willing to tell everything if the price was right. The editors made him an offer, a modest sum, enough to cover a month's rent and drinking money contingent on verification of his claims. Morgan accepted. Over the course of 3 days, in a series of interviews conducted in the magazine's Sydney office, he told his story. He said he had been aboard the Joyita as a paying passenger, travelling under a different name to avoid creditors who were pursuing him for debts incurred during a failed business venture in Fiji. He said he had boarded at the last minute, had not been listed on the official manifest because Captain Miller had agreed to carry him as a personal favour in exchange for a cash payment. He said he had been travelling with a small amount of money sewn into the lining of his jacket and a passport in a false name. He said the voyage had been uneventful for the first day and a half. The weather had been fair. The passengers had gathered on deck in the evenings, watching the sunset, drinking beer, playing cards. Captain Miller had been quiet and preoccupied, spending most of his time in the wheelhouse or below checking on the engines. The crew had been efficient but understaffed. Several of them were boys, really, teenagers from the Gilbert Islands who followed orders but seemed uncertain about what they were doing. On the second night, Morham said, the engines had failed. The ship had lost power suddenly, completely without warning. The lights had gone out, the pumps had stopped. Within minutes, water had begun to rise in the lower decks. The crew had tried to restart the engines, had worked through the night with flashlights and hand tools, but nothing they did seemed to help. By morning, the Joyita was listing badly and taking on water faster than the manual pumps could clear it. Captain Miller had ordered the passengers to prepare for evacuation. The lifeboats had been lowered. There were 2 of them, according to Morham, plus 3 inflatable rafts that had been stored on the upper deck. The passengers had been divided into groups, assigned to different boats, told to take only essential items. Dr. Parsons had been treating injuries. Several people had been hurt during the chaos of the night, cut by broken glass or bruised by falling equipment. One of the Gilbertese crewmen had suffered a deep gash on his arm that required stitches. That explained the blood, Morham said. The bloodied bandages were from the injured crewman, a young man whose name he could not remember but whose face he could describe in detail. Thin, with prominent cheekbones and a gap between his front teeth. The evacuation, according to Morham, had been orderly at first but had deteriorated quickly. One of the lifeboats had swamped almost immediately after launching, the result of a defective fitting that had caused it to ship water over the gunwale. The passengers in that boat had been redistributed to the other vessels, overloading them. Captain Miller had stayed aboard the Joyita, insisting that the ship would not sink, that help would come, that anyone who wanted to stay with him was welcome. Morham said he had chosen to go with the evacuation. He had climbed into one of the rafts along with several other passengers whose names he provided. The raft had drifted away from the Joyita in the darkness, pushed by currents and wind. By morning, the ship was no longer visible. They were alone on the ocean. What followed, according to Morham, was 5 days of drifting, dying and madness. The rafts had separated during the first night. His raft had carried 7 people, including 2 women and an elderly man. They had no water, no food, no navigation equipment. The sun had blistered their skin. The salt had cracked their lips. By the 3rd day, the elderly man had died and had been pushed overboard. By the 4th day, one of the women had gone mad, had thrown herself into the water and refused to be rescued. By the 5th day, only Morham and 1 other survivor had remained, a young Samoan man who had eventually succumbed to exposure and slipped beneath the waves. Morham said he had been picked up by a fishing vessel on the 6th day, delirious, sunburned, barely alive. The fishermen had been Japanese working illegally in waters claimed by the British, and they had been unwilling to report the rescue to authorities. They had dropped him at an unmarked beach in the Solomon Islands, given him a small amount of money, and warned him not to tell anyone what had happened. He had spent the next 7 years drifting through the Pacific Islands, working odd jobs, avoiding officials, trying to forget what he had witnessed. He had come forward now, he said, because he was tired of running, tired of secrets, tired of carrying the weight of 24 deaths alone. He wanted the world to know the truth. He wanted closure for the families. He wanted also to be paid. The Pacific Islands monthly editors listened to his story, took detailed notes, and immediately began attempting to verify his claims. They contacted the Fiji Port Authority for the original passenger manifest. They contacted the families of the deceased for photographs and physical descriptions. They contacted the Japanese fishing industry for records of vessels operating in the relevant waters in October 1955. Nothing matched. The passenger manifest listed 25 people aboard the Joyita, and Morham's name, or any plausible alias, did not appear. The physical descriptions he provided of his fellow passengers contained numerous errors. The Samoan officials had been middle-aged. Morham described them as young. The Williams couple had been in their 60s. Morham said they were in their 40s. The young Gilbertese crewman he blamed for the blood had a name that appeared on no record anywhere. The Japanese fishing industry confirmed that vessels had been operating illegally in the Solomon Islands region during that period, but none of the captains or crew members could remember picking up a shipwreck survivor. The timeline Morum provided did not match the known currents and drift patterns. If he had been on a raft that left the Joyita on October 3rd, he could not have reached the Solomons by October 8th. The distance was too great, the currents ran in the wrong direction. The editors confronted Morum with these discrepancies. He became defensive, contradictory, evasive. He accused them of working with the authorities to suppress the truth. He demanded additional payment. When they refused, he walked out of the office and was never seen again. The Pacific Islands Monthly ran the story anyway. In February 1963, under the headline, "Joyita Survivor Tells All or Does He?" The article recounted Morum's claims in detail, alongside the evidence that contradicted them. It concluded that Morum was almost certainly a fraud, probably a con man who had studied the publicly available details of the Joyita case and constructed a story designed to extract money from a gullible magazine. But it could not explain how he had known certain details that had not been publicly reported. The specifics of the radio equipment, the layout of the vessel's interior, the names of obscure crew members who had never appeared in the press coverage. Either Morum had done extraordinarily thorough research, the editors concluded, or he had some genuine connection to the Joyita that remained unexplained. Perhaps he had been aboard after all, under circumstances that differed from his account. Perhaps he'd known someone who had been aboard and had absorbed their memories as his own. Perhaps there was a kernel of truth buried somewhere in his lies, waiting to be excavated by an investigator more patient or more resourceful than the editors of a regional magazine. The article generated renewed interest in the Joyita case, briefly. Newspapers in Australia and New Zealand ran follow-up stories. A documentary producer in London began researching a film project that never materialised. The families of the dead received a fresh wave of letters and phone calls from amateur investigators and psychics, and well-meaning strangers who wanted to help. None of it led anywhere. Morum vanished into the Pacific or perhaps into memory, and was never conclusively identified or located. His story became a footnote to the larger mystery, one more unexplained element in a case that seemed to generate unexplained elements, the way the ocean generates waves. The families were left, once again, with nothing, and nothing was precisely what they had learned to expect. By 1963, the families of the Joyitas lost had endured 8 years of waiting, of false hopes, of official inquiries that promised answers and delivered only contradictions. They had learned to recognise the particular cruelty of a disappearance at sea, the way it denied them the ordinary rituals of grief, the way it left a door perpetually ajar that could never quite be closed. The bodies had never been found. The graves that existed were symbolic, markers over empty earth, monuments to absence rather than presence. The death certificates that allowed widows to remarry and estates to be settled had been issued based on legal presumption rather than physical evidence. Somewhere in the vastness of the Pacific, 25 people had ceased to exist, and the ocean had swallowed even the memory of how. But memory, unlike the dead, does not stay buried. In Apia, the Joyita herself remained a presence, rusting, decaying, impossible to ignore. After the salvage operation and the official inquiries, the vessel had been sold at auction for a fraction of her former value. Her new owners had grand plans for restoration, for returning her to service as the flagship of a new inter-island trading company. Those plans, like so many plans involving the Joyita, came to nothing. The repairs proved more extensive than anticipated. The hull was sound, that remarkable cork-lined hull that had kept her afloat when by all rights she should have sunk. But everything else had been damaged beyond economical repair. The engines that had failed so catastrophically on her final voyage were corroded beyond salvation. The electrical systems had been destroyed by weeks of immersion in salt water. The beautiful teak and mahogany fittings that had once made her the most elegant vessel in the Pacific trade were warped, split, cracked by the sun and the sea. She sat at the dock in Apia for months, then years, a monument to unfinished business. Children played on her decks, lovers met in the shadow of her wheelhouse, vagrants slept in her holds. The locals developed a superstitious aversion to her, crossing themselves when they passed, refusing to board her even on a dare. She was bad luck, they said. She was cursed. The ghosts of the missing passengers still walked her corridors at night, still waited for a rescue that would never come. Fishermen reported seeing lights aboard her after midnight, moving from porthole to porthole as if someone were searching for something. Dock workers claimed to hear voices, faint and indistinct, carried on the wind from her direction. A night watchman swore he had seen a figure standing at her bow, gazing out to sea, and when he approached to investigate, the figure had simply vanished. These were the stories that grew around the Joyita in the years after her discovery. They were almost certainly nothing more than the usual accretion of legend around any site of tragedy. The human need to populate empty spaces with meaning, to find ghosts where there was only grief. But they had consequences. The Joyita became difficult to sell, difficult to insure, difficult to crew. No captain wanted her. No sailor would sign aboard her. She was, in the parlance of the maritime world, a Jonah ship, and nothing could wash the stain of bad luck from her timbers. In 1960, she was finally sold again, this time to a salvage company that intended to strip her for parts and scrap what remained. They towed her to a beach on the outskirts of Apia and began the slow work of dismemberment. The engines were cut out and sold for scrap metal. The fittings were removed and auctioned to collectors. There was, by then, a macabre market for Joyita memorabilia, items touched by the mystery, artifacts of the unexplained, a ship's bell, a compass, a section of railing, a porthole. Each piece carried with it a fragment of the story, a connection to the 25 who had vanished. But the most significant artifact, the one that might have explained everything, was never found among the salvage: the Joyita's logbook. Every vessel of her class was required to maintain a ship's log, a detailed record of navigation, weather conditions, mechanical status, and noteworthy events. A properly maintained log would have documented Captain Miller's decisions in the hours and days leading up to the disaster. It would have recorded when the trouble began, what form it took, what measures were attempted, what failed, what succeeded, when hope was abandoned. It would have been, in effect, a chronicle of the voyage's final chapter, written in real time by the people who lived it. The logbook was not aboard when the Joyita was found. This absence was noted in all 4 official inquiries, but its significance was interpreted differently by each. The Fiji inquiry suggested that the logbook had simply been washed overboard during the weeks the vessel drifted, lost to the same ocean that had claimed the passengers. The Western Samoa inquiry speculated that the logbook had been taken by whoever abandoned ship, carried off in one of the missing life rafts as a record that might be useful if rescue came. The New Zealand inquiry, characteristically suspicious, raised the possibility that the logbook had been deliberately destroyed to conceal evidence of wrongdoing, that someone had removed it before the Joyita was abandoned, or perhaps even after she was found during the chaotic early days of salvage before proper chain of custody was established. The British inquiry, equally characteristically, declined to speculate, and simply noted the absence as one more unexplained element in a case that had many. None of them could say for certain where the logbook had gone, or why, or what it might have contained, but there were people who believed they knew. Among the maritime community of the Pacific, a rumour began to circulate in the years after the disaster, one of those persistent whispers that attaches itself to any great mystery and refuses to die. The rumour held that the Joyita's logbook had not been lost at all. It had been found, recovered either during the initial salvage or during the subsequent stripping of the vessel, and it had been suppressed. The question was by whom and why. One version of the rumour pointed to the insurance companies. The Joyita had been heavily insured, and the claims filed after her discovery were substantial. If the logbook contained evidence of negligence, of deferred maintenance, of known mechanical problems, of decisions that violated basic maritime safety protocols, the insurance companies might have been liable for far more than they actually paid. Better, perhaps, for the logbook to disappear than for its contents to become public record. Another version pointed to the colonial authorities. The Joyita disaster had been an embarrassment to the governments responsible for the Pacific territories, a reminder of how vast and ungovernable those waters remained, how quickly civilization could fail beyond the reach of radio and rescue. The inquiry findings had been carefully worded to avoid assigning blame, to spread responsibility broadly enough that no single official or institution could be held accountable. A logbook that named names, that documented specific failures, that provided a clear chain of causation from decision to disaster, would have undermined that careful ambiguity. Better, perhaps, for the logbook to remain unfound. A third version, darker than the others, pointed to the families themselves. 25 people had died on the Joyita, and their deaths had never been explained. The families had been left with nothing but questions and theories, each more painful than the last. What if the logbook contained answers that were worse than the questions? What if it documented not just how the passengers died, but at whose hands? What if there were things the families did not want to know? Truths that would transform grief into something uglier? Shame, perhaps? Or complicity? Or the knowledge that a loved one had done something unforgivable in the final hours before death? Better, perhaps, for some secrets to remain buried at sea. None of these rumours were ever substantiated. No logbook ever surfaced. No witness ever came forward claiming to have seen it, read it, destroyed it, hidden it. The Joyita's final hours remained unwritten, a chapter of history that existed only in the imaginations of those who wondered what it might have contained. But the absence of the logbook did more than frustrate investigators. It created a void, and voids, in the human mind, demand to be filled. Into the space where the logbook should have been, theories rushed like water through a breach in a hull. Theories that grew more elaborate, more desperate, more strange with each passing year. The pirate theory, the mutiny theory, the insurance fraud theory, the Japanese fishing boat theory, the Soviet submarine theory, the sea monster theory, the alien abduction theory. Each found adherents who were certain they had solved the mystery, who wrote letters to newspapers and magazines, who pestered the families with phone calls and visits, who saw in the Joyita's empty decks confirmation of their own particular obsession. And then there was the theory that had haunted the case from the very beginning, the one that official investigators had raised, examined, and ultimately set aside without resolution. Murder. The bloodied bandages found aboard the Joyita were never conclusively explained. The official inquiries noted their presence, speculated about their origin, and moved on to other matters. The Fiji inquiry suggested they might have been used to treat injuries sustained during the mechanical failure. A crew member burned by a backfiring engine, perhaps, or cut by flying debris. The Western Samoa inquiry raised the possibility of a medical emergency unrelated to the voyage. One of the passengers had been seriously ill after all, and a doctor with his surgical bag had been aboard. The New Zealand inquiry, with its customary suspicion, suggested that the bandages might indicate violence, a fight, an assault, perhaps even a killing, but noted that without bodies, without witnesses, without any physical evidence beyond the bloodstains themselves, this theory could neither be proved nor disproved. The British inquiry was the most thorough in its examination of the blood evidence. It sent samples of the stained bandages to a forensic laboratory in London, where scientists attempted to determine the blood type, the approximate quantity lost, and any other information that might indicate the nature of the injury. The results were inconclusive. The samples had been contaminated by salt water and exposure, degraded beyond reliable analysis. The blood was human, that much could be established, but nothing more. The laboratory report, filed in 1957, contained one additional observation that was not widely publicised at the time. The bloodstains on the bandages were not consistent with a single injury. The pattern suggested multiple wounds, or perhaps multiple patients, bleeding from different locations over an extended period. The staining was not the concentrated saturation that would result from a single catastrophic wound, but rather a diffuse, layered accumulation, the kind of pattern that might develop over hours or days of treatment, of rewrapping, of bleeding that stopped and stopped again. What this meant, no one could say. The doctor's bag remained another puzzle. It had been found open, its contents scattered across the deck, as if whoever had been using it had been interrupted in the middle of a procedure and had never returned to finish. The bag contained the standard instruments of a general practitioner in 1955, a stethoscope, a blood pressure cuff, hypodermic syringes, bottles of medications, surgical scissors, forceps, scalpel, suture materials. Several items were missing from their designated places in the bag's organised interior. The scalpel was among them, so were a significant quantity of morphine and a bottle of chloroform. The obvious explanation was that these items had been used in treating whatever medical emergency had occurred aboard. The morphine to manage pain, the chloroform perhaps for sedation during a procedure, the scalpel for surgery, though what kind of surgery could have been performed on a rocking boat by a general practitioner with no surgical team, no proper lighting, no sterilisation equipment, was difficult to imagine. A less obvious explanation, but one that several investigators raised privately even if they did not commit it to their official reports, was that the missing items had been used for something other than healing. Dr. Dorian Parsons was 54 years old when he boarded the Joyita in Apia. He had been practicing medicine in the Pacific Islands for nearly 20 years, first in Fiji, then in various remote postings throughout the British territories. He was known as a capable physician, steady under pressure, willing to work in conditions that would have defeated a less adaptable man. He had performed emergency surgeries by lamplight, delivered babies in villages with no running water, treated tropical diseases that most Western doctors had only read about in textbooks. His colleagues spoke of him as dedicated, perhaps even obsessive, a man who took his Hippocratic oath seriously, who would travel for days to reach a patient in need, who had once walked 30 miles through jungle terrain to deliver medicine to an outbreak of dysentery. But there were other stories about Dr. Parsons too, stories that circulated quietly among the European medical community in the Pacific, passed from one colonial administrator to another in the confidence of club rooms and dinner parties. Stories about his temper, which could be explosive. Stories about his drinking, which had become heavier in recent years. Stories about his marriage, which had ended badly, and about the circumstances of that ending. Circumstances that had never been made fully public, but which had resulted in his transfer from Fiji to a more remote posting where, as one administrator put it, he could do less damage. None of these stories proved anything. None of them explained what had happened aboard the Joyita. But they raised questions about what Dr. Parsons might have been capable of, under stress, under pressure, under the influence of whatever demons he had brought aboard with him. The families of the other passengers learned about these stories, inevitably. Some dismissed them as colonial gossip, the kind of casual character assassination that flourished in small, closed communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. Others were less certain. They wondered what had really happened in those final hours. They wondered whether the bloodied bandages told a story of mercy or a story of something else entirely. One family in particular refused to let the questions rest. Gilbert Williams had been a respected member of the Samoan business community, a man who had built a small trading company into a substantial enterprise through decades of patient effort. His wife, Evelyn, had been his partner in that effort, the bookkeeper, the diplomat, the steady hand that guided their business through the uncertainties of island commerce. They had been in their 60s when they boarded the Joyita, travelling to the Tokelau Islands to inspect a new trading opportunity that had been proposed to them. They were, by all accounts, cautious people, methodical people, not the sort to take unnecessary risks. Their son, Thomas Williams, was 42 years old when his parents disappeared. He was a lawyer in Auckland, far removed from the Pacific world his parents had made their home, but he had inherited their methodical temperament and their patience. He did not believe the official explanations. He did not believe the rumours and theories that proliferated in the press. He believed that there was a truth to be found, and that finding it was a matter of asking the right questions, of following the evidence where it led, of refusing to be satisfied with uncertainty when certainty was possible. In 1959, Thomas Williams began his own investigation. He travelled to Fiji, to Western Samoa, to the Tokelau Islands. He interviewed officials and dock workers and sailors. He read every document that had been produced by the 4 official inquiries, and he requested copies of documents that had not been made public: personnel files, insurance claims, bank records, correspondence. He hired a maritime surveyor to examine the stripped hulk of the Joyita and report on her condition. He commissioned a study of the currents and weather patterns in the Tokelau region during October 1955. He contacted the families of every other passenger and crew member, asking them what they knew, what they had heard, what they suspected. Most of the families cooperated. They too wanted answers. They shared letters their loved ones had written before the voyage, photographs, personal effects, anything that might shed light on what had happened. They told Thomas Williams about the small details that had never made it into the official record, the conversations they had had, the concerns that had been expressed, the premonitions that seemed, in retrospect, to have been warnings. But some families were less forthcoming. Some refused to speak with Thomas Williams at all. The family of Captain Thomas Henry Miller was among them. Miller's wife, Charlotte, had remarried by 1959. Her new husband was a civil servant in New Zealand, a quiet man with no connection to the maritime world, and Charlotte had made it clear that she wished to put the Joyita behind her. She had spent 4 years answering questions, defending her first husband's reputation, explaining his debts, accounting for his decisions. She had no more answers to give. When Thomas Williams contacted her, she replied through her lawyer that she had nothing to add to the public record and no desire to revisit the matter. Her children, she added, had been instructed not to speak with investigators of any kind, official or private. Thomas Williams respected her wishes, but he found them curious. Captain Miller had been a polarizing figure in the official inquiries, alternately a victim of circumstance and a reckless gambler who had endangered his passengers through negligence. His debts had been examined in detail, his character questioned, his decisions second-guessed. It would have been natural for his family to want the opportunity to defend him, to provide context that might exonerate him, to shape the narrative that had grown up around his memory. Instead, they chose silence. What did that silence mean? Thomas Williams could not say. Perhaps it meant nothing, only the exhaustion of a family that had endured too much scrutiny and wanted peace. Perhaps it meant that Charlotte Miller knew something about her husband that she did not wish to share, some truth that would be worse for his memory than the ambiguity that currently surrounded it. Perhaps it meant that the Millers, alone among the families of the Joyitas lost, had found answers of their own, answers they were not prepared to make public. Thomas Williams's investigation continued for 3 years. He compiled a dossier of more than 400 pages, documenting his findings, his interviews, his analysis of the evidence. He reached no definitive conclusions, but he developed a theory he shared with a small circle of journalists and maritime historians before his death in 1971, and which his own family chose not to make public until decades later. The theory was this: the Joyita had not been abandoned because she was sinking. She had been abandoned because she had become uninhabitable. Williams believed that something had happened aboard the vessel in the first hours of the voyage, something that had nothing to do with the engine failure or flooding or mechanical disaster. He believed that a crisis had developed among the passengers, a breakdown of the normal social order that governed life aboard ship. He could not say with certainty what form that crisis had taken. A violent argument that escalated beyond control, a medical emergency that triggered panic, a revelation, perhaps, about one of the passengers, something that transformed a neighbour into a threat. Whatever it was, it had shattered the trust that makes communal survival possible. The passengers had divided into factions, or had turned on one another, or had simply ceased to function as a group capable of coordinated action, and then they had fled. Williams believed that the passengers had left the Joyita not because they thought she would sink, but because they feared what would happen if they stayed. They had scattered into the ocean in whatever craft they could find, the life rafts, the workboats, the improvised floats, not to save themselves from the sea, but to escape from each other. Some had perhaps been forced off at knife point or gunpoint. Others had chosen to take their chances with the water rather than remain in the company of their fellow passengers. This would explain, Williams argued, why no survivors had ever been found. A coordinated abandonment, with passengers working together to navigate toward rescue, might have succeeded. A chaotic dispersal, with small groups fleeing in different directions, with no common destination, with fear rather than hope as their primary motivation, would have been doomed from the start. They had not been trying to reach safety. They had been trying to get away, and the Pacific, as it always did, had collected the debt. The theory was never verified. Thomas Williams died without proving it, and his dossier remained in his family's possession, unpublished, for another 30 years. When it finally became public, in a limited academic edition in 2003, it was treated as a curiosity rather than a revelation. One more theory among many, no more or less plausible than the others that had accumulated around the Joyita over the decades. But there was one element of Williams's research that did receive attention, both at the time and in the years that followed. Among the documents he had obtained was a letter, written by one of the Samoan officials aboard the Joyita in the weeks before the voyage. The letter had been addressed to a colleague in Apia, and it concerned the upcoming inspection trip to the Tokelau Islands. The official, a man named Tepilo Maui, was expressing his concerns about the voyage. He did not want to go. The letter was brief, only a single page, and its language was careful, the measured prose of a bureaucrat who understood that correspondence could be read by others. But the underlying anxiety was clear. Tepilo Maui had heard rumours about the Joyita. He had heard that her engines were unreliable, that her captain was in financial difficulties, that the vessel had been denied proper maintenance for years. He had heard too that the voyage was understaffed, that experienced crew members had refused to sign on, that the men who had agreed to crew her were inexperienced, desperate, or compromised in some other way. He was going anyway, because he had been ordered to go, because his career depended on following orders, because he could not afford to be seen as a coward or a complainer. But he wanted his colleague to know, in case something went wrong, that he had gone reluctantly, that he had known the risks, that whatever happened, it was not because he had been foolish or careless. The letter was dated September 28, 1955, 5 days before the Joyita sailed. Thomas Williams found it among the effects of the colleague to whom it had been addressed, a retired civil servant living in Fiji who had kept it for years without realizing its significance. The colleague remembered receiving it, remembered thinking that Tupelo was being paranoid, remembered joking with his wife about their friend's sudden attack of nerves. When the Joyita was reported missing, the colleague had retrieved the letter and read it again, and this time he had not laughed. He had kept it ever since, unable to bring himself to destroy it, unable to decide what to do with it. When Williams showed him the dossier he had compiled, the 400 pages of evidence and analysis and theory, the colleague wept. He had known, he said. Tupelo had known. They had all known, everyone who paid attention to the Pacific maritime trade, that the Joyita was a disaster waiting to happen. But they had done nothing, because doing something would have meant challenging the authorities, meant disrupting the commercial interest that depended on the vessel, meant taking responsibility for consequences they did not want to face. So they had looked away, had told themselves that the risks were overstated, had trusted that Captain Miller knew what he was doing, that the sea was not as dangerous as the fearful made it out to be, and 25 people had paid the price for their silence. The colleague died in 1963, 3 months after his conversation with Thomas Williams. He was 74 years old, in poor health, a man who had lived his whole life in the Pacific and had seen it change beyond recognition. His widow donated his papers to a local historical society, where they sat in cardboard boxes for decades, unexamined, forgotten, one more small fragment of a story that no one knew how to finish. The Joyita herself lasted a few years longer. The salvage company that had bought her stripped her to the waterline, taking everything that could be sold or repurposed, and then they simply left her on the beach where she'd been towed. She sat there for years, her hull half buried in sand, her remaining timbers bleached white by the sun. Children climbed on her during the day, animals sheltered in her shadow at night. The storms came and went, and with each storm a little more of her was carried away, until by the late 1960s there was nothing left but a dark stain on the sand where she had once lain. A shadow of a ship, the ghost of a mystery, a question mark written in rotting wood and rusted iron. Today, if you travel to that beach outside Apia, you will find no trace of her. The sea and the wind and the passage of time have erased even the shadow. Where the Joyita once rested, there is only sand and the endless rhythm of waves against shore and the cries of seabirds wheeling in the bright Pacific sky. But the mystery remains. It remains in the archives of 4 governments, in boxes of yellowed documents that no one has read in decades. It remains in the memories of a dwindling handful of people who knew the lost, who remember their faces, their voices, the particular way they laughed or frowned or carried themselves through the world. It remains in the theories and speculation that continue to circulate, passed from one generation of armchair investigators to the next, refined and elaborated and argued over in the endless conversation that tragedy generates. And it remains, most of all, in the questions that have never been answered. What happened to the 25 people aboard the Joyita? Why did they leave a vessel that would not sink? Where did they go? And how did they die? And why were their bodies never found? These questions have haunted the Pacific for nearly 70 years now. They have resisted every effort to answer them. The official inquiries, the private investigations, the confessions real and fabricated, the theories ranging from the plausible to the absurd. They remain open, like the wounds they inflicted on the families of the lost, wounds that time has scarred over but never fully healed. And perhaps that is the final terrible lesson of the Joyita. Perhaps some questions are not meant to be answered. Perhaps some mysteries exist precisely because the truth, whatever it is, would be worse than the uncertainty. Perhaps the Pacific, in its ancient and indifferent wisdom, understood something that the investigators and theorists and families did not. That there are things the ocean takes and does not return, secrets it keeps not out of malice but out of mercy, silences it enforces because the alternative would be unbearable. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the truth is still out there, waiting to be discovered, buried in some archive or remembered by some witness who has never come forward, patient as the sea itself, ready to emerge when the time is right. The Joyita sailed into the Pacific on October 3rd, 1955, and vanished from the world of the known into the world of the possible. She has been there ever since. The world of the possible. That phrase carries more weight than it might seem, because in the years following the Joyita's discovery, the possible expanded in directions that no one could have predicted. The official inquiries had closed their files. The salvage company had stripped and abandoned the hull. The newspapers had moved on to fresher tragedies and newer mysteries. But possibility, unlike certainty, does not require official sanction. It grows in the dark places where the facts run out, nourished by grief and hope and the fundamental human inability to accept that some questions will never be answered. In 1962, 7 years after the Joyita vanished from the world of the known, a letter arrived at the office of a solicitor in Auckland, New Zealand. The envelope bore stamps from the Gilbert Islands, a scattering of atolls some 1,500 miles north of Fiji, and the handwriting on the envelope was shaky, uncertain, the script of someone who had not held a pen in a very long time. Inside was a single sheet of paper, badly stained, and on that paper was a message that would reignite everything. The letter claimed to be from a survivor. It claimed to be from someone who had been aboard the Joyita on that October night in 1955, someone who had lived through whatever had happened, someone who knew the truth and was finally ready to tell it. The name at the bottom of the letter was not one of the 25 known to have been aboard. It was different, unfamiliar, a name that appeared on no passenger manifest, no crew roster, no official document anywhere. But the letter insisted. It insisted that its author had been there, had seen everything, had escaped when the others had not, and had spent the intervening years hiding, moving from island to island, afraid to come forward because of what he knew and who might want him silenced. The solicitor, a cautious man by training and temperament, did not immediately dismiss the letter. He had followed the Joyita case with the same grim fascination as everyone else in the Pacific maritime community. He knew that the official inquiries had left more questions than answers. He knew that the families of the lost had never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that somewhere, somehow, one of their loved ones might have survived. And he knew that the Gilbert Islands were remote enough, scattered enough, poor enough, that a man who truly wanted to disappear could do so with relative ease. It was not impossible, he wrote back. He asked for details, for proof, for anything that would confirm the letter writer's claims. He asked for a meeting, or at least a photograph, or the name of someone who could vouch for the writer's identity. He asked the questions that any careful man would ask when confronted with a claim that seemed too good, too convenient, too perfectly timed to be entirely trustworthy. The response came 6 weeks later. Another stained sheet of paper, another shaky hand. This time, the letter was longer. It told a story. According to this account, the Joyita had not suffered a simple mechanical failure. The flooding had been deliberate. Someone aboard had opened the seacocks, had sabotaged the pumps, had intended for the vessel to sink. There had been a struggle. There had been violence. The bloodied bandages that the salvage crew had found were evidence not of a medical emergency but of a fight, a brutal confrontation that had left men wounded and dying. Captain Miller had tried to restore order, but by then it was too late. The ship was taking on water faster than it could be pumped out, and the plotters, the letter did not name them, referred to them only as the men who wanted the cargo, had forced everyone into the boats at gunpoint. The letter writer claimed to have escaped in the confusion, a small dinghy overlooked in the chaos. He had drifted for days, had nearly died of thirst and exposure, had finally washed up on an atoll so remote that it barely appeared on charts. The islanders there had nursed him back to health, and he had stayed, had built a life, had married a local woman and fathered children and watched the years pass in the slow rhythm of the tides. He had never come forward because he knew what had happened to the others. He knew that the men who wanted the cargo had made sure there were no witnesses. He knew that if he revealed himself, they would find him, would silence him the way they had silenced everyone else. But now he was old. Now he was dying. Now he wanted the truth to be known, wanted the families to finally have their answers, wanted to die with a clear conscience, even if it meant dying in fear. It was a remarkable story. It was also, in almost every particular, impossible to verify. The solicitor brought the letters to the attention of the authorities. The New Zealand police contacted their counterparts in the Gilbert Islands. An investigation was launched. Quiet, unofficial, more curious than urgent. Officers travelled to the atoll named in the letter. They spoke to the villagers. They asked about newcomers, about strangers, about any man who had arrived in the late 1950s with a story of shipwreck and survival. What they found was ambiguous at best. There had been a man. The villagers remembered him. He had arrived sometime in 1956 or 1957. Memories differed on the exact date, and he had been sick, had been injured, had needed care. He had stayed for several years, had indeed married a local woman, had fathered 2 children. But he had not spoken of shipwrecks or cargo or violence. He had not spoken of the Joyita or of anything else from his past. He had been quiet, withdrawn, haunted by something he refused to name. The villagers had learned not to ask. They had accepted him as they accepted the weather and the tides, as one more mystery that the ocean had delivered and that the ocean would eventually explain in its own time. And then, sometime in the early 1960s, again, memories differed. He had left. He had taken a trading vessel to another island, and from there to another, and from there to somewhere else entirely. No one knew where he had gone. No one had heard from him since. The letters that arrived in Auckland could have come from him, or they could have come from someone else entirely, someone who had heard the story second-hand and decided to embellish it, to build upon it, to transform a simple tale of shipwreck into something grander and more sinister. The investigation stalled. The solicitor received one more letter, this one demanding money, a substantial sum, transferred to an account in the Gilbert Islands in exchange for more information and the promise of a face-to-face meeting. The solicitor, his caution finally outweighing his curiosity, declined. The letters stopped. The man who claimed to be a survivor, whoever he was, vanished back into the Pacific's vast anonymity. Was he real? Was his story true? The charitable interpretation is that he was exactly what he claimed to be, a genuine survivor of the Joyita, traumatized and terrified, who had hidden for years and then, in his final illness, had tried to tell the truth only to be dismissed by a world that had already made up its mind. The less charitable interpretation is that he was a con man, someone who had recognized the Joyita's enduring fame and the family's enduring pain, and had tried to exploit both for money. The most likely interpretation, according to the investigators who examined the evidence, lies somewhere between these extremes. A real person with a real story of shipwreck that had nothing to do with the Joyita, whose tale had grown and transformed over years of retelling until it attached itself to the most famous mystery in the Pacific, becoming something it had never been. We will probably never know for certain. The man, if he existed, is almost certainly dead by now. The villagers who remembered him are dead as well, their memories lost with them. The letters that arrived in Auckland have survived. They are preserved in an archive in Wellington, part of the official file on the Joyita, but they answer nothing. They are questions masquerading as answers, shadows pretending to be substance, one more dead end in a case that seems to consist of nothing else. But the letters mattered, even if they told no truth. They mattered because they showed that the Joyita had become something larger than itself, something that attracted stories the way a shipwreck attracts divers, something that could absorb any narrative and make it seem plausible. The mystery had taken on a life of its own. It had become a vessel for every theory, every suspicion, every half-remembered rumour that drifted through the Pacific. It had become, in a sense, a ghost ship twice over. Once, in fact, when it was found drifting and abandoned, and once in legend, when it became the empty hull into which anyone could pour their fears and fantasies and hopes. The 1960s brought other claims, other supposed revelations, other voices from the darkness claiming to know what had really happened. A man in Australia insisted that he had met Captain Miller after the disappearance, that Miller had faked his own death to escape his debts, that he was living under an assumed name in the Queensland outback. Investigation proved that the man in Queensland was a retired sheep farmer who had never been to sea in his life, and who bore no resemblance whatsoever to Dooster Thomas Miller. A woman in Hawaii claimed that her father, a fisherman, had found wreckage from the Joyita's lifeboats washed up on a remote beach, had hidden it out of superstitious fear, had never told anyone until his deathbed confession. The beach was searched. Nothing was found. The woman's father had died 20 years before the Joyita ever sailed. Each claim, examined closely, dissolved like foam on the tide. Each revelation turned out to be fantasy, or mistake, or outright fraud. And yet each one, for a brief moment before it collapsed, seemed to promise resolution, seemed to offer the answer that everyone had been seeking since that November morning in 1955, when the Gilbert Islands crew spotted the listing hull on the horizon. The families felt each of these false hopes acutely. Chuck Simpson's wife, Agnes, who had never remarried, who had never stopped believing that her husband might somehow have survived, allowed herself to hope when the letters from the Gilbert Islands surfaced. She made inquiries. She sent money to fund additional investigation. She waited day after day for news that never came. When the letters proved worthless, when the man who claimed to be a survivor turned out to be at best a confused stranger, and at worst a predator exploiting her grief, she withdrew from public life entirely. She had already lost her husband. Now she had lost the hope of ever learning what had happened to him. Friends said that she was never quite the same afterward, that something essential had been extinguished in her, that the final failure of the Gilbert Islands investigation had done what the original disappearance had not. It had made her give up. She died in 1974, still not knowing, and she was buried beside an empty grave marker that bore her husband's name and the single word "lost" beneath it. The Pacific had taken him, the Pacific had kept him, and the Pacific had refused to the very end to tell her why. The 1970s brought a different kind of attention to the Joyita. The mystery had aged out of the news cycle, had faded from the front pages, had become the province of specialty magazines and maritime history buffs. But it had also become, in a strange way, respectable. Documentary filmmakers discovered it. Authors researched it. The Joyita entered the canon of great unsolved mysteries, alongside the Mary Celeste and the disappearance of the Waratah and all the other vessels that had sailed into the unknown and never returned. In 1972, a young British journalist named Robin Moram, nephew of the famous novelist Somerset Maugham, published a book about the case. He had travelled to the Pacific, had interviewed survivors from the original investigation, had examined documents that had been sealed for years. His book, The Joyita Mystery, was the first comprehensive account of the disappearance, and it remains to this day the most thorough examination of the evidence ever assembled. Moram's conclusions were cautious, hedged with qualifications, but they pointed in a direction that the official inquiries had never quite been willing to follow. He believed that the flooding had been caused by corroded pipes in the engine room, that the bilge pumps had failed because they had not been properly maintained, that the crew had abandoned ship in a panic when they should have stayed aboard. But he also believed that something else had happened afterward, something that explained the bloodied bandages and the broken watch and the doctor's bag sitting open on the deck. He believed that the survivors, adrift in the Pacific in overloaded rafts and dinghies, had encountered something, he was never specific about what, that had killed them all. Pirates, perhaps. The Pacific of the 1950s was not the Pacific of today. There were islands where the old ways persisted, where strangers were not always welcome, where a boatload of castaways with watches and jewellery and gold fillings might prove too tempting a target. Or perhaps they had simply died of exposure and thirst, their bodies slipping over the side one by one as the survivors grew too weak to hold on, until there was no one left, until the last raft drifted empty across an empty sea. Or perhaps, and this was the possibility that Moram kept returning to, the possibility that he never quite dismissed, perhaps they had made it to land. Perhaps they had found an island, had struggled ashore, had waited for rescue that never came. The Pacific is vast. The number of atolls and reefs and isolated volcanic peaks is beyond counting. In 1955, there were still islands that had never been surveyed, sandbars that appeared and disappeared with the tides, places where a person could die within sight of the ocean's horizon and never be found. Moram's book was well reviewed but not widely read. It sold modestly in Britain and hardly at all in the Pacific, where the people who remembered the Joyita had no need to read about it. They carried the memory in their bones. But it established a template that every subsequent account would follow: the initial sailing, the discovery, the 4 inquiries, the theories and counter-theories, and finally the acknowledgement that the truth was probably gone forever, swallowed by the sea along with everyone who had known it. The 1980s and 1990s passed without significant developments. The witnesses died one by one, the documents yellowed in their archives. The Joyita became a historical curiosity, something that people encountered in books about maritime mysteries or Wikipedia articles about unsolved disappearances. The raw grief that had animated the early investigations gave way to academic detachment, the cool curiosity of researchers who had no personal stake in the outcome. The lost became abstractions, names on a list, statistics in a case study. But there were still people who remembered. There were still children who had become adults, adults who had become elderly who were approaching the end of their own journeys across whatever waters life had given them to cross. They remembered birthdays that were never celebrated, graduations that were never witnessed, weddings that took place with an empty chair where a father or brother or son should have sat. They remembered the telegram that had arrived, the official letter that had followed, the long silence afterward that had never really ended. They remembered, and they carried that memory like a stone in their chests, a weight that no amount of time could entirely remove. In 2005, 50 years after the disappearance, a small ceremony was held in Apia, Samoa. A handful of elderly relatives, a few local dignitaries, a reporter from a New Zealand newspaper, and a curious tourist or two gathered on the waterfront where the Joyita had once been moored, where Captain Miller had once paced the deck and worried about his debts and his engine and the cargo he had promised to deliver. A wreath was laid on the water. Names were read aloud, all 25 of them, slowly, with pauses between, so that each name could be heard and acknowledged and remembered. The ceremony was brief. The speeches were short. There was little left to say that had not been said 1,000 times before, little comfort that had not already proven hollow. But there was something in the gathering itself, something in the act of standing together on that waterfront and speaking those names into the Pacific wind, that mattered in a way that words could not quite capture. The families had been robbed of funerals, of burials, of the rituals by which human beings process death and begin to heal. This ceremony, modest as it was, gave them something they had never had, a moment to grieve together, a place to focus their sorrow, a time set apart from ordinary life in which the lost could be honoured. Afterward, the participants dispersed. Some returned to their homes across the Pacific, to New Zealand and Australia, and Fiji and the distant islands where the Joyita's passengers had originated. Others lingered on the waterfront, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, watching the water turn from blue to gold to red. One elderly woman, she would have been a child in 1955, the daughter of one of the Joyita's passengers, stood at the edge of the dock for more than an hour, staring out at the sea. When someone finally approached her, asked if she was all right, she smiled a sad smile and said that she'd been waiting all her life for her father to come home. She'd known, intellectually, that he never would, but there had always been a part of her, a small and stubborn part, that had refused to accept it. Today, she said, she was finally letting him go. The sea did not answer. The sea never answers. It keeps its own counsel, guards its own secrets, maintains its own silence against all the grief and hope and desperate questioning that human beings bring to its shores. The woman stood there until the light was gone, and then she turned and walked away, and the Pacific continued its endless conversation with the land. Waves against rock, tide against sand, the ancient rhythm that had been going on since before there were humans to listen, and that would continue long after there were none left. The Joyita had sailed into that rhythm 60 years before. She'd become part of it, and the 25 people who had been aboard her had become part of it too. Not dead exactly, because death implies a known ending, but absent, vanished, transformed into something that was neither presence nor absence, but rather a kind of permanent question, a wound in the fabric of the knowable world that would never quite close. The 21st century has added little to our understanding of what happened. New technologies have made it possible to search the ocean floor with unprecedented precision, to examine old documents with techniques that were not available to the original investigators, to construct computer models of how a vessel like the Joyita would have drifted if abandoned in various locations. Enthusiasts have applied these tools to the mystery with varying degrees of rigour and success. Drift analysis suggests that the Joyita, given the prevailing currents and winds, could have ended up where she was found if she'd been abandoned somewhere north of Fiji, in the vicinity of the Minerva Reefs or the Lau Group. This is consistent with her intended route. It is consistent with the theory that something went wrong early in the voyage, but it proves nothing. It is one more piece of circumstantial evidence in a case that consists of nothing but circumstantial evidence. The sea keeps its secrets. The wind carries away the words we speak to it. The dead do not return to explain themselves, and the living who might have known are all gone now, their knowledge gone with them, their stories ended without endings. There is one more thing to tell, one final thread to follow before this account can draw to its close. It concerns not the mystery itself, but the meaning we have made of it, the uses to which we have put this tragedy of 25 ordinary people who sailed into the Pacific and never came back. In the years since the Joyita vanished, her story has been told and retold in ways that would have astonished the people who actually lived it. She has been the subject of books and documentaries, of television specials and podcast episodes, of countless articles in magazines devoted to the unexplained. Her name appears in compilations of maritime mysteries alongside the Mary Celeste and the Carol A. Deering, those other vessels found adrift and abandoned under circumstances that have never been satisfactorily explained. She has become, in a sense, public property, a canvas onto which anyone can project their own theories, their own fears, their own fascination with the darkness at the edge of the map. Some of these retellings have been careful and conscientious, mindful of the fact that real people died and real families grieved. Others have been less so. The Joyita has been absorbed into the literature of the paranormal, claimed by writers who see in her fate the fingerprints of forces beyond human understanding. She has been linked to the Bermuda Triangle, despite being located on the opposite side of the world. She has been cited as evidence of everything from sea monsters to time warps to extraterrestrial intervention. In certain corners of the internet, her story has been embellished with details that appear in no primary source. Phantom radio transmissions, mysterious lights in the sky, crew members who supposedly exhibited strange behaviour in the days before the voyage. These additions have no basis in fact. They are the barnacles of myth, accumulating on the hull of a story that has been adrift in the cultural ocean for 7 decades. It would be easy to mock these theories, to dismiss them as the fantasies of people who cannot accept that the world is full of unanswered questions. But to do so would be to miss something important about why the Joyita continues to fascinate, why she refuses to fade into the footnotes of maritime history, where other, equally tragic disappearances have long since been forgotten. The truth is that the Joyita matters because she represents something that human beings find unbearable. The possibility that we can lose people utterly, completely, without even the cold comfort of knowing how they died. We are storytelling animals. We make sense of our lives by constructing narratives, by imposing beginnings and middles and ends on the chaos of existence. We need our stories to have conclusions, even if those conclusions are sad. A death that can be named and dated and understood is a death that can be mourned. A death that remains permanently uncertain is a wound that never closes. This is why the Joyita's survivors, not the people aboard the vessel but the families they left behind, have carried their grief for so long. It is why the elderly woman stood on the Suva dock for more than an hour, waiting to let go of a father who might, against all reason, still walk back into her life. The absence of certainty preserves hope, and hope in such circumstances is a form of torture. The families of the Joyita's passengers have been suspended between grief and waiting for nearly 70 years. Some of them died in that suspended state, never knowing what happened to their loved ones, never able to say the final farewell that brings the finality that permits healing. The wild theories, the sea monsters and the aliens and the pirates with their impossible conspiracies, are, at bottom, attempts to provide an ending where no ending exists. They are the imagination's way of filling the void left by the absence of facts. A Joyita taken by extraterrestrials is a Joyita whose fate, however bizarre, is known. A Joyita whose passengers fell victim to supernatural forces is a Joyita whose story has a conclusion, even if that conclusion belongs to the realm of fantasy rather than history. The fantastic explanations are not alternatives to the truth. They are refugees from the unbearable possibility that the truth is simply gone, erased by time and tide and the Pacific's ancient indifference. But there is another way to understand the Joyita's enduring power, one that does not require us to invent endings or to retreat into fantasy. It is the understanding that emerges when we sit with the mystery rather than trying to solve it, when we allow the unknowing to teach us something about the nature of the world and our place in it. The ocean covers more than 70% of our planet's surface. Its average depth is more than 2 miles. Its volume is so vast that all the land on Earth, if it were ground to powder and dumped into the sea, would not fill a tenth of it. We have explored more of the moon's surface than we have of our own ocean floor. We know more about the topography of Mars than we do about the abyssal plains that lie beneath the waves of our homeworld. The sea is, quite literally, the unknown. It is the great mystery that surrounds us, the darkness into which we peer, and from which, sometimes, strange things emerge. The Joyita sailed into that darkness. She carried 25 human beings. People with names and histories and hopes and fears. People who loved and were loved. People who laughed and wept and dreamed of futures they would never see. They sailed into the unknown, and the unknown swallowed them. And when the vessel emerged again, drifting and empty, it was as if the sea had delivered a message that we lack the ability to read. Here is your boat. Here are the artifacts of human life. Here is everything except the answer to the only question that matters. Here is the outline of a story with the centre torn out. To sit with this, to accept it without the false comfort of invented explanations, is to confront something essential about human existence. We do not control the world, we do not understand it. The darkness at the edges is real, and sometimes people sail into it and do not come back, and no amount of investigation or speculation or desperate hoping will change that fact. This is terrifying. It is also, in a strange way, humbling. It reminds us that we are small, that our knowledge is limited, that the universe is under no obligation to make sense to us or to provide the closure we crave. The Joyita's story is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a meditation on the limits of human understanding. It is a reminder that there are questions that will never be answered, losses that will never be explained, griefs that will never be resolved. This is not a comfortable lesson, but it is a true one, and there is a kind of dignity in accepting it, in honouring the memory of the lost without pretending to know what happened to them, in holding space for the mystery without rushing to fill it with fantasies. Captain Thomas Henry Miller knew this, perhaps. He was a man who had spent his life on the ocean, who had seen its moods and its power, who understood that it gave and took according to its own logic and not according to human desires. He had survived a war and a shipwreck. He had watched friends die and had himself been left for dead. He knew, better than most, how thin was the membrane between existence and oblivion, how quickly the world could turn and how little it asked for permission. When he took the Joyita out of Apia Harbour on that October afternoon in 1955, he was not naive about the risks he was taking. He was a man who had looked into the abyss before and who had somehow found his way back. He knew that the sea does not negotiate, that it does not bargain, that it keeps its own counsel and guards its own secrets. Perhaps that knowledge gave him courage. Perhaps it gave him a kind of peace. We will never know what passed through his mind in the final hours, whether he fought against the darkness or accepted it, whether he died hoping or despairing or simply doing what sailors do, trying to keep his vessel afloat and his people alive for one more hour, one more minute, one more breath. What we know is that he was there, at the helm or on the deck or somewhere on that listing vessel, and that he did not abandon it. The Joyita was still above water when she was found. Her unsinkable core had held. If Miller had wanted to save only himself, he could have. He could have taken one of the boats, headed for the nearest land, and let the others fend for themselves. He did not. Whatever else happened on that voyage, whatever failures of judgment or equipment or luck led to the disaster, Miller stayed with his ship. He went down, or out, or into the unknown, with the vessel he had commanded. This is not quite a heroic ending. It is not a story of triumph or redemption, but it is a story of fidelity, of a man who kept his post even when keeping it meant dying. The code of the sea is old and harsh. The captain is the last to leave, or he does not leave at all. Miller honoured that code. In the final accounting, when everything else is stripped away, that is what remains. He did not abandon the Joyita. He did not abandon the people who had trusted him to bring them safely across the water. He stayed until staying meant becoming part of the mystery itself. One more unanswered question, in a case that consists of nothing but unanswered questions. The Joyita herself has been gone for decades now. Her hull, weakened by years of neglect and exposure, was eventually broken up. The wood was salvaged, some of it turned into souvenirs, some of it simply discarded. There is no grave to visit, no memorial to photograph, no physical remnant of the vessel that once carried 25 souls into the unknown. She exists now only in photographs and documents, in the fading memories of those who saw her, and in the words of those who have written about her. She has become a story, and stories are more durable than wood or steel. They can be passed from one generation to the next. They can be told and retold, interpreted and reinterpreted, kept alive by the simple act of remembering. The 25 who sailed on her have become part of that story. Their names are preserved in the records of the inquiries, in the passenger manifests, in the newspaper articles that were published in the weeks after the discovery. Chuck Simpson and his wife, bound for Fakofo with their cargo of medical supplies and good intentions. The Gilberta's crew members, skilled sailors who had spent their lives on the water and who knew its rhythms as intimately as they knew their own heartbeats. The copra buyers and the traders and the ordinary people who had simply needed to get from one island to another and who had booked passage on the Joyita because it was available and because they trusted its captain to bring them safely home. They are all gone now. Their lives, which were as real and as complex as any lives, have been reduced to names on a list, to brief biographical sketches in books about the disaster, to footnotes in a mystery that has overshadowed everything else about them. This is the cruelty of such events. The people become characters, the tragedy becomes a puzzle, and the human reality of 25 individuals who laughed and loved and feared and hoped is flattened into a narrative convenience. But we can push back against that flattening. We can remember that the Joyita's passengers and crew were not extras in a mystery story. They were the point of the story. They were the reason it matters. Every theory about what happened, every investigation, every inquiry, every wild speculation, all of it is, or should be, in service of a simple truth. Real people died, and they deserved better than to have their fate become an entertainment. This is not to say that we should stop asking questions. The desire to know what happened is natural and even, in its way, honourable. It is an expression of the belief that every human life matters, that every death deserves an accounting, that we should not simply shrug our shoulders and move on when people vanish from the face of the earth. The families of the Joyita's passengers deserve answers, even if those answers are no longer possible. The investigators who worked on the case deserved better evidence than they received. The mystery itself is an affront, a violation of the basic human need to understand. But there is a difference between asking questions with humility and demanding answers that the universe is not obligated to provide. The Joyita has been silent for nearly 70 years. She's not going to speak now. The sea has kept its secret, and it will go on keeping it, and no amount of determination or cleverness or desperation will change that fact. We can accept this with grace, or we can rail against it without effect. The mystery will remain either way. And so we are left, in the end, where we began, with a vessel found drifting in the Pacific, half submerged and empty. Her passengers and crew vanished as completely as if they had never existed. With a radio tuned to a frequency that could save no one. With a doctor's bag and bloodied bandages that hint at a story we will never hear. With a captain who stayed at his post and was lost with his ship. With 25 ordinary people who became, through no choice of their own, participants in one of the great maritime mysteries of the 20th century. The sun still sets over the Pacific. The waves still roll toward shores where people stand and stare out at the water, wondering what lies beyond the horizon. Somewhere in that vastness, in the deep and the dark and the silence, the story of the Joyita has its ending. An ending that we will never know, that no one now living will ever know, that has been swallowed by the ocean and held there, inviolable, forever. This is not a satisfying conclusion. It is not the ending that the families of the lost deserved, nor the ending that the investigators who spent years of their lives on the case hoped to deliver. It is not the ending that we, as listeners, might have wished for, having followed this story through its twists and contradictions, its false leads and dead ends, its moments of hope and its long stretches of despair. But it is the only ending that the truth permits. The Joyita is gone, her people are gone. The questions remain and will remain, and the sea does not answer. There is a lighthouse on the coast of Fiji, not far from where the Joyita was built, where she spent the early years of her life ferrying passengers between the islands. On clear nights you can see its beam sweeping across the water, a pulse of light in the darkness, a signal to the ships that pass in the night. The lighthouse was there in 1955, sending its message into the void. It is there still, doing the same work it has always done, guiding the living and standing watch over the dead. The Joyita would have seen that light many times, outbound and inbound, departing and returning. Miller would have known its rhythm, its flash and dark, its steady reassurance that land was near and safety closer still. On the night of October 3rd, 1955, as the Joyita headed north toward Tokelau, the lighthouse fell away behind her, its beam growing fainter and fainter until it was just a flicker on the horizon, and then nothing at all. The ship sailed on into the darkness, and the darkness received her, and she did not come back. 69 years later, the lighthouse still turns, the beam still sweeps, the message still goes out night after night, year after year, a voice crying in the wilderness for ships that may or may not be listening. Most of them are. Most of them see the light and adjust their course and make their way safely to harbour, their passengers and crew delivered from the dangers of the sea, their voyages completed, their stories granted endings, but some do not. Some sail past the light and into the unknown, and the light cannot follow them, and the darkness keeps what it takes. This is the truth that the Joyita teaches, if we are willing to learn it. The light is there, the harbour is there, the way home is marked and mapped and known. But the sea is larger than the light, and deeper than the harbour, and older than all our maps and all our knowledge. It was here before us, and it will be here after us, and it keeps its secrets not out of malice, but simply because that is its nature. It is the unknown, it is the mystery, it is the darkness that defines the light. 25 people sailed into that darkness on an October afternoon in 1955. They were real, they mattered, they deserved to come home, they did not, and the sea keeps its silence still.